Good evening, everybody. I'd like to call to order the regular meeting of the Larkspur City Council tonight. It's Wednesday, March 1st at 6:30. Allison, could I get a roll call, please?
Councilmember Carroll.
Here.
Councilmember Hara.
Here.
Councilmember Way.
Here.
Vice Mayor Kendall.
I'm here.
Mayor Paulson.
Here. And for those of you who are able, please rise and we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So our next agenda item is public comment, and this is for matters that are not on the agenda tonight. So if anybody in the chamber would like to make a comment, please come up to the stand and just tell us your name and where you live. Okay, seeing nobody right now. Allison, do we have anybody in the queue who would like to make public comment?
For any raised hands from our Zoom audience members? And there's no public comment.
Okay, so let's close public comment then and go to the next item, which is presentations and proclamations. And tonight we have none. So with that, we'll go to the approval of the consent calendar. And tonight there are 5 items. They were posted publicly. Does anybody in the public want to pull an item from the consent calendar or make any comments? Anybody in Zoom, in the queue, Allison? I don't think I hear anybody here.
Correct. I'm looking for any raised hands and there is none in the Zoom audience.
Okay, great. So any council members want to pull an item from the consent? No. Okay, so I'll entertain a motion to pass the consent calendar in its entirety.
Motion to approve.
Second. Great. We have a motion and a second. Allison, could we please get a roll call?
Yes.
Councilmember Hara.
Yes.
Councilmember Way.
Yes.
Vice Mayor Kendall.
Yes.
Mayor Paulson.
Yes. And with that, we'll go to the city manager's oral report.
Just some calendar items this evening, Mr. Mayor and council members. I want to remind everybody we're in the midst of 2 public comment periods on items that we know have been of interest to members of the community. So one of those comment periods that's going on at the moment is for amendments to our green building code. You've heard these referred to as the REACH codes. So these are codes that would call for electrification of new construction and some other issues and matters related to electrification and attempting to address climate issues through some of our code ordinances. So we would encourage folks who are interested to take a look on our homepage of the website. You'll see the information about the comment period. We'd like to get comments by April 3rd so they can be folded into material that'll be presented at a public presentation on April 19th. And that presentation will be online with more details to follow. And then the other comment period that we're currently doing is for a reusable foodware ordinance. That's one that a lot of the jurisdictions throughout the county are visiting right now because county environmental health has asked all the communities who are interested in potentially partnering with environmental health to consider and if they intend to adopt an ordinance before May of this year. And so you'll be having a workshop during your next council meeting on the 15th to hear a little more about the ordinance with our intent that you'll be holding a hearing about it in April. So we'd like to get comments here shortly for that workshop that's going to take place on the 15th. And with that, Mr. Mayor, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you. Any questions for the city manager on any of those items or anything else?
Yeah, one question, are we going to be sending any kind of notice to the restaurants?
Yes, so we not only put out the just general notice electronically, but we reached out to the chamber and other vehicles that we have to target the affected restaurants. We pulled down a list off of environmental health so we could specifically notify the businesses we believe are affected by the ordinance.
Okay. Yes, please.
I just wonder if you could take the opportunity with the heavy storms we've had and the ones that continue just to sort of remind residents where they can pick up sandbags I know the atmospheric rivers may have passed us by this point, but there's still need for water control. Just, and sorry, Julie,
Chief,
I-
can you remind me where they are? I
Where
know
the
there's
sandbags
some of
are?
them are at Piper, but are the other ones at Heatherwood?
Heatherwood and Piper, I think.
Thanks.
They could also get sandbags at Fire Station 14.
Okay.
If they're in the vicinity. And then we've got some on the east side of Corridor as well within Coach School. And so
Great.
those are the locations where we can find sandbags.
Thanks.
Great. Anything else?
No.
Any other questions, comments? Nothing? Okay, great. So with that, we'll move to the council members' oral reports and comments. Any council member have anything to report?
Kevin always does.
Come on.
Back on the 21st, we had the Golden Gate Bridge Fair meeting, which I made a point of attending because I heard from a couple of constituents that their bus runs had been canceled. And so I was looking into it, and over 35 runs were canceled that week from Southern Marin to San Francisco. And because they were experiencing an acute driver shortage, Mr. Mullins of the Bridge District was at the meeting, and I specifically was asking him about it. And they have a class graduating next month, but he never got around to answering the question of how many are they short and how many are graduating from the class. I hope it's enough to at least fill some of those runs. But there are some issues I'm still going to be raising with them, and that's number one, based on a 2019 contract, which was understandable at the time pre-COVID. There's 5 Golden Gate Transit drivers that are covering the early morning BART runs because of some BART construction, which is the contract was supposed to end, I believe, in April or May. And I was curious whether they were going to pull it back, because that's 5 drivers that could be, it's revenue neutral. It's not costing us anything, quote unquote, but it just kind of rankles me. We're canceling our runs for Marin customers for BART. I'd rather they were over here doing our runs. And I was trying to get numbers on whether or not they've done any studies on the duplication of the Santa Rosa to San Rafael bus drivers versus what those passenger counts are versus the Smart Train passenger counts for the same service. I suspect both are low. I know the Smart numbers are low after the 1 or 2 of the first trains, but that's just something I'm going to be looking more into. I'll let somebody else talk about Marin County Council of council members and mayors, because I didn't take very good notes, quite frankly. The mayor and I were at a meeting on the 23rd about a 101 connector options that Tamalpais Transportation Authority of Marin is proposing. All 3 of the routes that they want us essentially to sign a memorandum of understanding. But the 3 routes they've picked out of, I think, originally 6 options, quite frankly, they don't meet either California or federal freeway interconnection standards. They're very low speed, and I don't think they're going to be of much help, quite frankly, to Larkspur's traffic problems. Also, they're only really looking at the west to east connection, the evening connection, and not really looking at the inbound traffic, which is what really impacts our traffic on Sir Francis Drake and the on-ramp that affect Green Bay and Ross Valley. Former council member Hilmer was not a big fan of all this, so they're still waiting on a traffic study, which I think we'll look at before we bring it back to here. At the TAM meeting that night, there was a transfer of $135 million to this project. So we'll see what happens afterward. There was the planning and environmental reports for Highway 37 have been posted. And apparently there's been some agreement among different agencies to try to speed up the process a little bit, because initially they were talking about 2030 was going to be the earliest. And last but not least, on that Friday, it was a busy week. The county's trying something new. Called participatory budgets. And this is where the public actually decides what projects the county should be spending money on. And the county's made about $2.5 million available for this, and any community can apply for it, not just the unincorporated, but also the communities. And there's been, I think, about 175 projects that have been proposed. Only one is even close to us, and that was you can get up from either $10,000 to $250,000 for any project. And the staff will help you turn it into a grant proposal, and then the community as a whole votes on it online. And this is going to be going on between now and May of this year. So if there are any community groups that are interested, if they want to contact me, I'll be happy to share the materials and guide you to the right people. So far, the 175 projects, none are in Larkspur. And the nearest one is in Corte Madera, and that's a proposal to turn the theater on Tamil Vista into a teen center. So that's it.
Great, thank you, Councilmember Carroll. Anybody else?
Sure. So I represent Larkspur on the Marin Mayors and Council Members Legislative Committee. We met on Monday. And just a few, what this committee does is there's a representative from every city, and the lobbyists who work for the Cal Cities, which is our professional organization in Sacramento that pays attention to legislative issues that affect cities and towns. So this group looks at and keeps updates on legislation that may be pending in Sacramento that will affect Marin. So one thing that I came away with was 2,632 bills have already been introduced this year since January into the legislature. So there's a lot of bills that this group continues to look at. Some of them won't make it. Others will be shifted around, and that process is taking place now. Our assembly person, our new one, Damon Connolly, has introduced a few bills that are that will be potentially very helpful for Marin. One of them has to do with wildfire property insurance, and we'll see how that goes. He's also introduced some legislation about vegetation spreading of pesticides on highway medians, and that would affect us too. So we're looking at that. I think we're all paying attention to SB 423, which is another bill about housing that Senator Wiener has introduced. And there are a lot of housing bills that will, and I see Elise, our planning director, kind of cringing, because these are very significant impact on small jurisdictions like ours. Senator Wiener's bill, which is, like I said, 423, will remove coastal wetland protections from housing development areas. And wetland habitat protections will be reduced. So we have a lot of wetlands in our area, so we'll be paying attention to this to see what that does. It's fairly, I think, very important that our community understands that we are at the responsibility of our housing processes come from Sacramento right now, and they're coming even more stringently. So we'll keep an eye on this, and we'll see. There lots going to be happening this year. That's pretty much it for me.
Right. Councilmember Haroff or no?
Today.
Not today. Okay, great. So yes, go ahead.
Just one more thing. I would really like to compliment our staff that ran the Planning Commission meeting last night. There were over 150 people on the Zoom call. And I was working, so it was very interesting. I had an architect and a physician in the taxi listening into the meeting, and they were very impressed. Like, they're from Mill Valley. They were very impressed at the presentations, particularly how well the meeting was run. It was, I initially thought, oh God, this is going to go forever, quite frankly. Be like a Fairfax 3 a.m. thing, but they did it very well. And we're sort of the canary in the coal mine. I think this is the first real project that falls under some of the state restrictions. And the explanations from staff were very clear. And I kudos to our attorney. I don't generally like to compliment attorneys, having come from a family of them, but it's I got a much better understanding of some of the restrictions we now have. You did it in pretty close to layman terms without making it too simple that people might get the wrong ideas about, they couldn't misinterpret it. And I was very impressed with all the work done by our staff last night. I just wanted to mention that. Thanks.
Great. And so I just have two brief reports. One is we have been listening to a lot of public comment from Skylark, the apartments, and on a completely different note, we're also, as a community, trying to think about their safety, their wildfire safety. So the neighborhood response groups are holding their first meeting up at Skylark tomorrow at 7. And hopefully we'll have really good attendance, and I'll be there. I think Chief Martin will be there. And the goal is as with all of our, areas, whether it's Madrone or Wiltshire or Christmas Tree Hill, the wooded areas, to get people to know their neighbors and, get some basic procedures in place and learn how to work, under a situation where there might be evacuation or shelter in place. And then the second is I'm still holding office hours. I do it every Tuesday. I had one yesterday, 2:30 to 3:30. And I want to thank all the people who come. It's been a pleasant surprise to see, people coming every week. And a minor anecdote is, I learned one woman came in and had prepared all kinds of notes, and the upshot was she didn't know how to submit public comment. So she didn't know really what that was or how that works. And she had this big research paper. She thought, that would be good for me. And I said, I think you should make this public comment. So maybe I'll, get together with the staff and, we can just put in the newsletter a simple instruction just so that people feel more able to participate in all the many decisions and things coming our way this year. So with that, I think we're done with council members' reports. And
I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor.
yes, please. Yeah.
I'm sorry, just
Yeah.
wanted to make sure I had an opportunity to just report on a couple of different things.
Okay.
So just for information, folks will remember that I'm Larkspur's representative to MCE Clean Energy. We had our first full board meeting on the 16th. Which is interesting because I think we now have 36 people on that board, which is probably makes it the biggest board in the world of that sort. The main thing that got accomplished was essentially cleaning up some governance issues and electing Gabe Quinto of El Cerrito as the vice chair of the board. So congratulations to him. Let's see, on the 24th, our mayor, I don't think you mentioned the meeting that we had with Bon Air.
Oh, no.
So let me just mention that the mayor and I did meet with the management of Bon Air Shopping Center and the apartments back behind to talk about the prospects for rent stabilization in the city of Larkspur. There was I'll let the mayor provide his own comments on it, but I'll just leave it at there was a vigorous conversation with no particular outcome. And back to MCE, this Friday is the first meeting of the board executive committee, which I chair. We are back to in-person meetings. So I'll be rotating my attendance at those meetings between San Rafael and Concord. This time in San Rafael, but looking forward to getting back together in person. Off we go. That's it.
Yeah, I just was going to ask either mayor or council member who was at that meeting with representatives from Bon Air, if you could elaborate, because I can't ask you other than right here because of the Brown Act. And I would be interested if there were any things from that meeting either of you wanted to share that we might want to take into consideration when deciding the rent stabilization issue.
So I can do it if you want.
Yeah, go for it.
Uh,
The city manager
oh,
might want to
yeah.
chime in
It
first.
might be better to refer to them by their corporate name, which is Greenberry Property Management, which is the largest owner of apartments in Larkspur. I think the way it was represented might be confusing to folks. It's a separate matter that they happen to also own the shopping center.
Yeah, and that, I'm sorry, I was sloppy.
I just wanted to make sure everybody
I understand.
understood.
Again, it was a worthwhile conversation. Several levels of management were in attendance at the meeting, in addition to Gabe and me. And I believe the views that were expressed at the meeting by management was vigorous opposition to rent stabilization in the city of Larkspur. Nothing was decided, nothing was concluded at that meeting, but to answer your question, that's what we heard.
Yeah, can I ask, and again, I'm curious, if we are toying with,
I'm just wondering,
Yeah,
before you go,
yeah.
since this is not agendized.
Yeah, I
we're
was gonna
crossing
say.
Into a sketchy lane
That's
here.
actually what the city manager and I were just whispering about. This is, brief reports are allowed, and some brief questions, but at a certain point, since it's not an agendized item, you'll need to cut it off.
okay, so I guess.
And I hope I didn't go beyond
No,
that
no,
role.
I think more beyond this point.
Okay.
Was probably going to start.
Point taken.
Yeah, and I was gonna just say that I think we have the rent stabilization item on the agenda for the next meeting on the 15th. So I'm glad the issue is brought up and it's not meant to, have a deliberation up here, but what I'm hoping is, as we've heard so much public comment, the 5 council members will really have a chance to do exactly what you're wanting to do. So it's just a question of timing. That will be on the agenda. People who are really concerned will be able to attend. So we just want to report out, in principle, that we're doing our homework. I mean, personally, I'm reaching out to as many renters and landlords, and I want to try to bring those pieces of information to the next meeting. So, okay, so with that, we're done with the council member oral reports and comments, and the next agenda item is public hearings, and we have none tonight. So we move on to item 8, which is the business items, starting with the budget updates from the public safety JPAs. So I believe we start with Chief Martin.
No, I'll start with me. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, sorry, the city manager.
So, Mr. Mayor, council members, I'm well, that's true. I'm one member of the management committee that oversees the 2 public safety joint power authorities that we manage for police and fire. And their budget practice and process is underway now at the management committee level and at the chief level, and with the finance officers for the 2 joint powers authorities. In the past 2 years, some of the council members have asked for an opportunity to understand what's going on with the JPA budgets before you work on your own budget. So I wanted to give you that opportunity by having the 2 chiefs come this evening and make these presentations, but it's a little constraining because we're too early in our next fiscal year budget process to present a lot of concept from what's going to happen going forward. So what I asked the chiefs to do is use their current fiscal year budgets and talk about how they're doing. Their budgets don't move a lot from year to year because they're so personnel driven, even more so than the rest of city operations. And you'll hear more about that from the 2 chiefs. And then I do want to remind, even before I turn over to the 2 chiefs to do their presentations and take questions, the way those 2 JPAs are structured, we always have the option as a member agency to buy up our own services through the authority as a direct charge. What you're going to hear about tonight is our participation in the joint operation that we fund with the other member agencies. But on occasion, we have our own needs for, actually, we have regular ongoing needs for fire support because they provide our fire marshal services and they bill to the applicants through us, which I think they do for the Court of Madera as well. And then in the case of the police, from time to time, we do buy up targeted needs that we have. For example, additional parking enforcement or additional traffic enforcement or security. Those are the types of things we regularly do. And every once in a while, we have a policy challenge that we decide to purchase. So that's always, as we go in our own budget cycle, that's always something the council should keep in mind, that that's an option for you, that we won't focus on that much this evening. So with that, did we put you first, Ruben? Do you take it? I guess Chief Norton couldn't be here in person this evening. He is on the Zoom, so he'll be presenting from the Zoom.
Yeah, we'll go first then. I want to thank the city manager for framing the conversation this evening. And thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members for having us today. This is going to be kind of a high level overview of kind of where our budget is today, what for the current fiscal year, and then at the very end, kind of what we anticipate major changes coming up for the next upcoming fiscal year that we're trying to project out. Also want to apologize to Councilmember Haroff and Way. You may have seen part of this presentation through our fire council. I try to reduce the slides. However, I think to be able to play or portray the picture of what your fire department does and how your dollars are invested within the fire service is for me, I had to frame it in what we do as an agency and how we're created. So we'll start off with the beginning slide here is our mission statement. So the mission statement of any agency is to tell ourselves and more importantly, the community of why we exist and why are we here. And for us with the Central Maryland Fire Authority is to protect the lives and property through fire prevention, public education, and all risk emergency service. That means we respond to anything and everything that we get called upon. And we value that preparedness through preparedness, community involvement, and ethical application of skills and knowledge, and maintain quality of life and safety for our community and visitors. And then the next slide talks about the philosophy and goals of our organization is as to be recognized as an all risk leaders within the region through prevention, protection, and responsible local governance. And as you can see here is we do that by maintaining a high performance organization, by creating an environment that's inclusive and rewarding for our employees. Because I feel as a fire agency, our biggest asset that we have and the biggest thing that we can provide are the employees that work for us. They provide that service day in, day out, 24/7. And being able to support them and develop them throughout their career is important for us within the organization. With that, it goes to adhering to our budget and long-range capital and salary maintenance. And through that is through the budgetary process, working with the city manager and our other executive manager within the town of Corte Madera and our finance manager. Next slide here kind of shows what our org chart looks like. Two items that I want to play out that should be on top of where it says fire chief, because in reality, it's the citizens of both Corte Madera and Larkspur that sit on top and control everything that we do. Without their support, we couldn't exist and be successful. And then below that is the fire council, which is represented by 2 members of Larkspur and 2 members of the town of Corte Madera. And it just kind of goes down to our hierarchy with the fire chief and then the services we provide in divisions with fire prevention, administrative battalion chiefs, and it kind of breaks down into each station what we staff on an overall basis. And when we say here, like for example, station 15 shows 3 members of each, that's 1 of each per shift. And we usually hold a 3 platoon shift that we call A, B, and C, where our individuals are on for 48 hours straight and then 96 hours off. And then here is our current 22-23 operating budget. So we started out with slightly above 11.5 million. And that budget is made up between primarily of contributions of 2 member agencies, is Larkspur and Corte Madera. And then also includes RVP revenue for our fire engine paramedic program. There's approximately 800,000 or so from Measure C funding, which is our Marine Wildfire Prevention Authority tax, and then miscellaneous revenue, taxes, and and then permits and fees. And permits and fees come from our fire marshal fire prevention services, because the way the fire department budget runs, the way it's funded is 2 forms. One is through the general fund, which is provided through Larkspur and Corte Madera. And then there's also fee for service for one individual, for example, a contractor coming in for a single project. We charge that contractor for our time and services. And so here, if you can see for equally shared, it's about 44.7% of our budget is a contribution from the city of Larkspur. On the next slide, it kind of gives a breakdown of what our rough high level expenditures are for our 22-23 operating year. And as you can see, about $8.5 million of that goes towards our salary and benefits. So the majority of our $11.5 million budget, or about 80% of that, goes towards salary and benefits for employees, and about $2.5 million is left for us to run the operating general fund budget of our fire services, which is keeping our rolling stock moving, keeping everything up to speed, making sure we have got all the equipment that we need to respond to all the calls that are demanded and needed by our community members. Next slide is just a representation of the 4 divisions that we run within the organization. It's our admin, fire prevention bureau, training, and operations. Breaking that down into administration is the leadership of the organization, providing guidance, organizing, strategic planning, both short and long term, continued recruitment, and any kind of personal matters that may come up. And as we are here today is the budget and planning and implementation component of it. Our fire prevention bureau, which is our forward facing portion of our organization, which is out there and I believe makes the most contact with our community members, is responsible for our fire inspection program, which includes both our local business fire inspection program. So all of our businesses get inspected every other year. And then we're also mandated to the state to inspect certain occupancies annually, regardless, based on law, which is your hotels, motels, apartment complexes, assembly buildings, and so forth. Anything that where they anticipate any large loss of life or potential loss of life, we have to inspect those annually. We also do a pretty good public education program. Disaster preparedness falls under our fire prevention bureau, which is our neighborhood response groups, CERT programs, and so forth. And then the big component of it is the wildfire community risk education and mitigation program. And here's just kind of an image of what we do for our organization out there on public education on the fire prevention side. A lot of it is getting out there and explaining to our community members what actual hazards exist and then what values we provide to them as an organization. Our wildfire risk reduction, just a quick overview. Some of you are very well versed in the Measure C and MWPA, but that was passed by our voters in 2020, which created approximately $841,000 that come back into the jurisdiction. And half of that is collected from the city of Larkspur, and the other half is contributed by the town of Corte Madera. And portions of that were designed that are geared directly back into the community are for our defensible space program, which we go out and do home evaluations. And then local hazard mitigation programs, which primarily deal with voluntary abatements and any kind of projects for hazard risk reduction that we can see out there. And then, of course, the zone or central core funding is 60% of the tax measure that's collected within our zone comes back to the community. And that's our zone is from Highway 101 all the way to Whites Hill and Fairfax. So all the communities within the greater Ross Valley are considered the central zone. And 60% of the tax dollars that are collected come back into that zone. And collectively, we work together to try to prioritize what are the biggest target hazards that we need to work on. And part of that, you can see this here, was a greater Ross Valley shaded fuel break that was implemented in 2021 or actually 2022, and the planning process for that started in 21. So it's a big project that it's creating a 150 to 200 foot shaded fuel break. Basically, we're getting rid of all the flammable vegetation, and it'll encompass the entire communities of every agency within the greater Ross Valley. And then it talks a little bit about here, there's 150,000 that's contributed by Corte Madera under their Measure F funds, and that's because Measure C couldn't supplant any existing programs that were in place prior to that tax measure. So whatever you're doing before the tax measure, you had to continue doing that. And here's kind of some rough numbers of what we've done and some images. We've done approximately 2,100 See if I can read that correct. I can read on the sheet. 2,100 inspections with 2,200 re-inspections. And the reason why the re-inspections are higher is because we didn't capture all of these inspections on the first go around, potentially because no homeowner was owned. So we as a fire department do not trespass on people's properties. Is we come in invited, and if we couldn't capture them the first time, we were able to capture them on a second inspection. And then it also talks about how many acres we were treated, which is 113 acres, and 1.7 miles of roadways were cleared. And then Todd Lando, who's our hazard mitigation specialist, I don't know how he did it, but he was able to manage 84 projects within the last fiscal year. Training division. The training division is important for us because it keeps our firefighters up to speed on the latest and greatest skills, knowledge, and abilities for them to do their job. And here it just kind of gives you a rough number of what was done within the last calendar year. So you can see our firefighters, a little over 6,700 hours of tactical fire training, which is approximately about 200 hours per employee. And that's typically either done on duty or off duty, going to seminars and classes and so forth. Here's some images of what we do. Since we say we're all risk, we train for everything, which is anything on the water, hazardous materials, vehicle accidents, rope rescues. And then of course, our bread and butter is fire, fire suppression. That's why most of us got into the field. And then our operations is closely tied into our training bureau, because what we train on is directed by what our operations are. Based on whether Cal OSHA's changed requirements or regulations, we have to change how we operate and so forth. So as you can see, we respond to everything. And then in the 2022 calendar year, our agency ran just under 4,000 calls for service, with EMS calls being about 2,400, or the lion's share of that call volume. 74 fire incident calls that we went on where there was actually something burning, whether it was within our jurisdiction or out of our jurisdiction. And then 1,480 calls or slightly above was for others, which are calls for service, which could be lockouts, pick up and put back in bed, someone fell, assisting a resident with a tree down, trees over the roadway, wires down, flooding. During that 2021 October rainstorms, we saw were a huge peak in services for that day, which was 86 calls for service just within a 12-hour period, just for our jurisdiction.
Can you expand just on the EMS part of that, kind of
Yeah,
what
so
they enter?
EMS calls would be anyone calls 911 for heart attack, chest pains, shortness of breath. I fell down and I got hurt. Vehicle accidents where they needed to get transported, cardiac arrest, any kind of traumatic events, COVID-related emergencies where someone needed to go to the hospital or something.
And I'm sorry, could you also just expand a little bit so we understand? Somebody calls 911. Does the dispatcher decide whether it's routed to fire or police? Is it the closest person there? How does that work?
So with the 911 system, the public safety agency responsible for receiving those calls are your law enforcement agencies. So here within the county, it's Marin County Sheriff's Office. The city of San Rafael has their own police department, their own dispatch center. They're the 911 receiving agency. So for us, our dispatch center is currently being dispatched by the Sheriff's Department. And for them, they receive the call and then they decide based on fire or law, well, they'll direct it to the next bay over, which is basically from me to you, is where the fire bay is. And they'll go, okay, they'll transfer it over and they'll pick up, and then they'll start what's called the EMDR process, which is a series of index cards that based on what is answered by the person calling in, they'll flip to that card and they've got to get through all those instructions to properly, or those are pre-arrival instructions before the fire department gets there. And that's how they kind of dictate whether it's fire or law related. Okay. We'll move on to the next slide. And here is just a 4-year average of where we were. We're pretty consistent here within our jurisdiction, anywhere between 35 to 3,900 calls. I look at these numbers not necessarily to see how busy we are as an agency, because that's all numbers tell you is how busy you are. I start looking for trends. Are there long-term trends where for us as an agency, we're getting busier and busier, where then now we may have to redirect our resources somewhere else? Whether do we need to upstaff a second ambulance for certain peak periods? Do we need to upstaff additional fire engines for red flag days and so forth? So we start looking at those trends. And for me, that's kind of what I look at here. And as you can see in 2020, EMS calls kind of dropped a bit. And that's because COVID-19 hit and people were afraid to call 911 for services because they were afraid to go to the hospital because they were afraid they were going to contract the COVID-19 virus, either in the ambulance or at the hospital. So a lot of people deferred some of their care because of that. And then here's some images of our operations. This image on the fire council may recognize, but for those of you that didn't, on January 27th, we had a fire here off of Palm Avenue in the Blue Rock neighborhood area. And so these pictures were captured off of that fire. And so budgetary changes are what we're anticipating for the 23-24 fiscal year. Working with our finance director, and these are just preliminary numbers. And some of the big things that we need to look out for is, of course, salary and benefits go up. We have no control over that. Those are obligatory based on MOUs and contracts we have with our labor groups. But the big one that we should see is dispatch services. Last fiscal year, we were contacted by Marin County Sheriff's Office, who decided that he is no longer interested in dispatching fire services and that we need to move along and start dispatching ourselves. So we looked at different options, and the best option that was available for all of us as fire agencies to stay unified was to are we contracting now with Marin County Fire Department to provide those services with us? And what that does, it keeps all the fire agencies together. And so that way we're able to know where we need to send resources across multi-jurisdictional boundaries if needed. And so that's where we're seeing the biggest increase. It's about a 45% increase plus $150,000 one-time cost for bringing on board a new IT person, changing from the sheriff's CAD system to a standalone fire dispatch CAD system, because based on Department of Justice rules and regulations, there's got to be a physical firewall between the two. We can't watch and see any of the law stuff. And then the increase as well is because now instead of sharing supervisors or dispatch supervisors with the sheriff's department, we're now going to have our own standalone dispatchers. And so that's kind of part in there. And then the other component that keeps increasing that is the workers' comp insurance rates and our property and liability insurance. And we're part of a joint powers authority with several agencies throughout the Bay Area. And with that is the end of my presentation, and I'm free for any questions if you have any.
Great, thank you, Ruben. Any council members questions? Scott, please.
Sorry. So my questions revolve around training and just to put it out there, I have a background civil rights law, and people sometimes still call me, for stuff in Marin. And I hear some calls about somebody who calls 911 for a mental health, related issue, drug related issue. I even had somebody had an epileptic seizure, and they call 911 and the police show up, and the person handling it may not be what they were trained or had sufficient training to handle that type of situation, and it goes badly. And I guess my question is, for your department, are there people who they have some type of specialty in dealing with those types of issues, so they can, obviously, if there's a bank robbery, the training you need to handle an armed bank robbery is very different than somebody who is having a mental health issue. And I imagine the same would go for, a normal EMT, having a heart attack or a stroke is very different than mental health issues.
Correct.
Are there people who we have 2 people on our staff, and there are expert psychologists, psychiatrists, people to deal with that. How do we deal with those things?
So that's a lot to unpack there. I can't speak on behalf of how law enforcement handles these calls. I can speak on behalf on our training on the fire side.
Right.
Is that during our EMT and or paramedic training, we go through a behavioral health training component of it. And trying to figure out, okay, what is going on with an individual to try to figure out to get to the root cause of it. Sometimes we may call for assistance based on the combativeness or the scene safety of our staff. And that's when we may call for assistance with law enforcement. When it comes to someone coming out of a seizure, we're very well trained that we know they're going to be postictal, which is the phase where they're confused and combative, which could also be a diabetic person. You know, they get very combative when their blood sugar gets low, especially some that are insulin dependent. When it gets into that component, we get a lot of training on how to deal and try to de-escalate that because we're there to help. And so a lot of times for us is where it gets difficult is trying to restrain a person who's being combative. We've got protocols within that are given to us by the county Office of Emergency Services on how to handle combative patients. So we've got soft restraints if need be. However, as EMT and paramedics, we don't have the legal right to detain someone against their will. So if someone wanted to get up and run away, we can't do anything about it, even if though they're a risk to themselves or others. And so if that component is when either law enforcement or a doctor has to put them on a medical hold, basically what's called a 5150 hold, that we've identified that they're a risk to themselves or others, that where we now need to put them on that hold so we can take them against their will to a facility that's appropriate to treat them for whatever condition they have.
Okay, and could you explain, I would imagine in that type of situation, correct me if I'm wrong, probably both police and fire would end up at the scene, you know, the police to make sure that somebody was not combative and maybe fire to do the frontline, you know, dealing with a mental health issue. When that happens, who's in charge so that, you know, who makes the determination, hey, this person is becoming combative, we need law enforcement to step in and detain them, or hey, we're fire, we understand that this person is post seizure but we can handle it. How does that work?
So a lot of it comes down to when the 911 dispatcher receives a call and the information that's given to them, they will then put the call depending on how it's portrayed. If they say someone's running around with a gun and suicidal, then we as fire agencies stage until it's been determined that the scene is safe for us to enter. If it's a seizure post-ictal and someone may be combative, they will give us the luxury of making that determination in the field. A lot of times medical related, if there is nothing that is dictating that we need to stage, we go directly in. A lot of times we arrive at the same time. And in those scenes, medical and fire take the lead, and law basically sits behind and waits for us for any direction to make sure we're okay. A lot of times they're in and out. And most of the time it's with us.
Okay. All right, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Scott. Any other questions? Yes, Kevin.
On the permits and fees, who determines the amounts on those?
We looked at it based on our old system on how much time and material goes into reviewing plan review and follow-up inspections. And so we just do a flat rate for the most part. It is one flat rate and it covers plan review, consultations, and any kind of inspections that are associated with it.
And how often do you update?
The last update was when we first introduced it was in 2019.
Okay. And then I was noticing in the call for service, the rather dramatic jump from 51 to 66, then up to 77, and then to 74. And I assume that's because more people were staying at home here in Larkspur who might have otherwise gone to their office, but there wasn't any real change in the fire situations. I mean, are there more, what I'm thinking in terms of like butane fires because of fire pits or, you know, those kinds of things are just generally.
We're pretty fortunate that I think the manager, him and I were having a conversation about the fire on Palm, that for us, we're fortunate enough we don't have those events regularly. You know, because I think we do a very good job at the fire prevention side of it on educating our community members on how to be safe at home, how to not create those dangerous environments that could then not only impact them, but their neighbors. And we do that also at the business level as well, as because we understand that if a business has a fire, it not only impacts them, it impacts their employees, it impacts the community that then goes and utilizes the services of that business. So it's huge impact. So for us, we put a lot of emphasis on the fire prevention side of it.
Yeah, thank you.
Just had one comment. Or-
Yes, please.
Thanks, Chief. I did see this at the fire council meeting, and to your photographs of the fire that happened on not Palm Court, but Palm Avenue.
Yeah.
One of them, it's not one of the photos here, but one of the most compelling photos to me that I think is important that we communicate to our community about the responsibility of evacuation and safe parking on our roads was the photo you showed of a rig with one of the firefighters trying to retrieve safety equipment from the side compartments of the rig, but having to pretty much struggle to get there because the road was so narrow and this firefighter was having to stand on the downslope of the road because the road was so narrow. And that really hit home to me how we need to really bring home to our community the importance of proper parking and evacuation routes, not just for them to exit or for fire rigs to arrive to a scene, but for the safety of our fire personnel who are trying to extract safety gear from the sides of their vehicles in these really tight quarters. So add that picture. I think that was a really compelling picture. It struck me having lived in this world for a long time that I hadn't seen that kind of image and the risk that we were putting, potential risk for injury to the firefighter just to extract gear. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll go ahead and put that on.
Yeah.
Future slides.
We would be happy to come back with the chief and with Public Works and bring a whole bunch of photos from around town about how scary some of our situations are. The one you're citing, we can't do anything about because
Right.
it's the physics and the geography. We have neighborhoods with narrow streets where people park on both sides of the streets and there's no trucks going through there. You're gonna burn if a fire goes, or we're gonna have to crash into cars. I mean, it's one or the other because that's the way people are choosing to park. And we probably have to have a serious conversation about only allowing parking on one side of a street, for example. And that's a tough conversation.
Well, I was sort of teeing that up because I'm ready to have that conversation. And I think it's, as we move further into the Marine Wildfire Protection Act and the evacuation route planning, after seeing that picture and seeing the risk that we put, not only the potential risk for not being able to respond properly to a fire because they couldn't extract their equipment, but just the potential risk we were putting to our firefighters. So I'm teeing that up, that I'm ready to have that conversation when we're ready for it.
Bring it forward.
Great. Any other questions? Any other comments? No.
I just have one quick follow-up. And sorry, I'm just thinking about what we were talking about earlier. Last question is, do you believe that the fire department has the sufficient training, that the individual officers have sufficient training to deal with mental health issues that come up? And do you feel it would be beneficial to have additional training? And would you need additional funding to have that additional training? Or do you feel everything's fine the way it is?
I can always say we can always use additional
And money.
and funding for it because it's the resources to be able to provide new programs and new trainings. Yeah, I think we can always do better.
Thank you.
I just had a couple things. First, I wanted to express some gratitude to Chief Martin. I've been for 3 years interacting with you on the MWPA and neighborhood response groups, and almost like clockwork, every Monday, first Monday of the month, Chief Martin is there. And, we have 20 interested neighbors at a minimum or about that, and lots of good public education. So that part of your mission, I firsthand experienced and want to thank you for. And then knowing your role and Chief Lando's or Todd Lando's role on the MWPA and the Shady Ross Valley Fuel. I think that's just wonderful work. So thank you for that. My two questions are, very general, but I think, since we're queuing this up a little bit for budgetary stuff, about recruitment, because I'm hearing that recruitment in general is quite difficult. And if you can just say anything general, how that might be going and impacting us fiscally. And then also about the fire stations with, our public works director sitting behind you, and we keep looking at the capital improvements plan. And we know that both fire stations, what might that do operationally this year, 5 years, 10 years from now, if we did nothing, or, what we might need to do.
Okay, so I'll start off with recruitment. The recruitment issue is dire for the fire service, which is the first time I've seen it in my career, to where having 4 vacancies and having only 7 applicants with only 1 qualified applicant moving forward was pretty disheartening. Typically for the fire service is you put a job flyer out, wasn't even called recruitment. You just said, hey, we're hiring, and you had groves of people coming in. Now I'm not sure what is happening, but it's not just here locally, it's region and statewide. I'm hearing from my colleagues up and down the state that everyone's having a hard time hiring, and we just don't know where the workforce went. Right now I've got, we've given 1 job offer, and I've got 3 more vacancies to fill. And so we had to refloat it and get creative with our fire council executive management team on how we can recruit better. And so that's always going to be a challenge. And for us in the fire service, we need to reframe on what we're doing in recruitment, and we need to get better at it. And we need to go out and meet the recruits where they're at, which is within the communities, within the junior colleges, and maybe even starting at the high school level, is going to these recruitment fairs and starting to get their interest piqued in the fire service and the value and the rewards that this career brings. And so that's kind of where we're at there. On the facility study, I'm working with staff to try to move next steps forward. After that facilities report came out, we all understand that the stations need some help. And we're trying to get that forward so we can hopefully have a plan in place within the next couple of years to then strategize on where we need to go. I think first steps would be to try to figure out strategically through probably a standards of cover to try to see where we're at as an organization of our call volume, response times, and so forth. And the standards of cover will also dictate what best locations stations need to be. And so I think that'll probably be the first step, because to understand where we want to go, we got to understand where we're at. And I think part of the facility study started that. And I think the next steps would be probably getting the standards of cover moving forward.
Great. Thank you very much. Yes, Councilmember Carroll.
I noticed a couple of times I've seen it looks like training going on in the back lot of Redwood High School. How often do you do that on a regular basis?
Yes, we do. We've been very fortunate to have a great relationship with Redwood High School. It provides us an opportunity to have ample open space where we can then pull as much hose as we want off of there and squirt water and do all of our training and simulate what we're going to do. It also helps with up and coming new engine operators so they can learn and practice that craft of how to operate the engine and maneuver all levers on pressurizing each line and so forth. So we utilize that tremendously. And it also helps out with our driver training to get our new recruits up and running to the rodeo. And you can see them doing the serpentine with the delineators and so forth. So we've been very fortunate that they've allowed us to use it. So
Well, it occurred to me as a suggestion, if you're doing it on a regular basis, to perhaps work with school staff on advertising it to the students to come and look and just watch, because I think you probably attract both male and female parties that might be interested. And if you're there anyway on a Saturday or Sunday, and sometimes the kids are going to be there for a practice or something, they might come an hour early just to observe it. It's good PR if nothing else, but who knows, it might lead to recruitment down the road.
yeah, your recommendation, I'll run down. I'll make sure I reach out to the high school staff.
Great, thank you. So if there are no more comments or questions, I think we go to the public and see if there are any questions from the public for Chief Martin. Anybody in the chambers want to ask a question, make a comment? All right, Allison, who do we have in the queue?
I'm looking for any raised hands from our Zoom audience members. There's no public comment.
Okay, well, job well done. Thank you, Chief Martin. And I guess we'll move next to the city manager. I think we're queuing up for Chief Norton.
Chief Norton's participating by Zoom, so he looks like he's here now.
Welcome, Chief.
Hi, thank you, Mayor, members of the council. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just have a few things I'd like to share with you. All right, I'm assuming you can all see that. Okay, everyone can hear me? Everyone can see the PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
All right. So mine's a little different. It's a little more numbers heavy, I think, but I'll be definitely glad to answer any questions you have at the end. This is our current budget that we're in right now. I will say our finance director we pay to use your finance director, Kathy Oram. And our budget is prepared basically by getting direction by the three managers, because in addition to Larkspur and Corte Madera, we serve the town of San Anselmo. And we're just starting to spool that up right now. And once we get direction, Kathy and I work on the budget. It takes quite a while. I'm actually going to show you a little bit of the budget at the very end. And once we have something we feel is a good product, we send it out to the managers. They give it another look. And then it goes before the police council, where you have two sitting members, Councilmember Way and Haroff, and along with two from our other two jurisdictions. And it requires, I think it's a unanimous vote or a super majority or something, but we've never had a nay occur during the budget. And that happens every year at our May Police Council meeting. So with that, I'll give you a little overview of how we do our budget and some of the numbers. This is how we're set up. This is half of our department. Our PIO retired recently, unfortunately, a few months ago, Margot Rohrbacher. We miss her. But I have two lieutenants, one captain, one chief. You can see where it says Sergeant Patrol, and there's 4 of those. We work 12-hour days, 6 to 6, and we have 4 teams to cover the town's 24 hours, 7 days a week. Each shift, when we're fully staffed, has a sergeant, a corporal, and 4 to 5 officers. In addition, we have a standalone, when we're fully staffed, we have a standalone traffic division. These are the officers on motorcycles, and under them, we have our parking cadets. As you may be aware, recently, we also are in the process of bringing on 2 full-time community service officers who will be working exclusively for the city of Larkspur and the town of San Anselmo. And their main purpose is going to be parking enforcement. And they're also proactively going to do a lot of work in your parks in terms of dogs off leash, who's using the fields, things like that. Because we've had a lot of calls for service out there and a lot of interest from people in addressing that better. And support services, our other lieutenant oversees it. This is our investigations bureau, where we have a detective sergeant who also oversees all of our training. We have 2 officers that go to various task force and assist there. One is 80% reimbursable. The other one that we send to the Marin Task Force, they waive our fee for that service. In addition, we have our school resource officer and our juvenile detective. Our juvenile detective also handles all sex crimes. And we have 2 general detectives. So they would be the ones following up if your house gets broken into, something like that. In addition, we have civilian staff. As Chief Martin mentioned, our dispatching is done by the sheriff, and we pay the salary and benefits of 5.5 dispatchers to handle our 911 services and our general call taking, not during regular business hours. What we have on our actual payroll is 3 front counter records clerks. They're the ones, if you come into our station, that'll be sitting there answering the phone during the day and helping you. We have a property technician that deals exclusively with evidence. A lot of her work nowadays is getting body worn camera video ready for the district attorney's office for prosecution of crimes where we arrested someone. And we used to have records evidence cadets, but we've eliminated that by bringing on another full-time front counter records clerks. We also have 3 very dedicated volunteers that we've had for many years. And if anyone listening to this is interested in helping us and volunteering for free, please reach out to me. We can always use more help, especially down in our records division. And they help with filing and running general errands and things like that. And they're very invaluable to us. So the way our budget is funded, how it's paid for, our budget is basically broken into 7 sections: administration, communications, investigations, SRO juvenile, field operations, and traffic. Some of these are split between our 3 jurisdictions evenly, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. That would be your administration, communications, investigations. The rest of it is through a funding formula. This funding formula, which you can see to the right, you can see the respective shares. Larkspur's is 33.71, is based on several years. We looked for like averages of calls for service, total crimes, total citations, and total accidents occurring in the specific jurisdictions. And then a weight was given to those. This was actually first created in 1980. And so it's got many years of smoothing and being tweaked. It's at this point, it's 42 years old. But the numbers were voted to be locked in a couple of years ago by the council, just because what was happening was from year to year, it was fluctuating a lot. And this we kind of felt was a fair amount that was voted on by the council to have some smoothing, so cities don't get hit with a big bill one year out of the blue, and they can kind of be a little more consistent. Revenues similar to fire, 94% of our revenues come directly from the towns and cities. Here's another view of the revenues. I won't go through all of these, but we get a little bit of other revenue through maybe some overtime or things like that and selling items, but really the bulk of it. And you can see there's a CMFA contribution down here. That's for, we employ the human resources director that is shared equally between us, Larkspur, Corte Madera, and Central Marin Fire, and that's their share of that. In terms of expenditures, this isn't a great pie chart because it just shows the different divisions, but essentially 76.8% of our total expenditures is tied to our salary and benefits, with an additional 7% tied to dispatcher salary and benefits. So about 83% of our total budget just goes to personnel costs. There's another view of that. If you're curious about how costs have gone over the last 10 years, if you're not familiar, we formed from Twin Cities Police and San Anselmo Police Department, merged in 2013, and the year prior to that, they started sharing services. Since then, you can see Larkspur share how it's starting to, you can kind of see where it goes up and where it goes down. A lot of the flattening here, I think it occurred about 6 years ago when we, for financial reasons, had our dispatchers. We started using, instead of having in-house dispatchers, we started using the sheriff and contracting with them. It had a pretty significant cost savings with really no drop off in service. Before I take questions, I do want to share something else with you. I really recommend, if you've never seen it, going to our website. One of our goals this year is to completely revamp this website because it's about 10 years old and it does not work on a cell phone at all, which is super frustrating for everyone, including me. But if you go to our website and you go to reports and budgets, for one thing, you can see kind of our calls for service and statistics where Ruben touched on some of his. This is about, I think, 20 pages or so worth of that. And you're welcome to look at that on your own time. But I will tell you, we average about 35 to 40,000 calls for service a year, and that's pretty consistent. But also here, you can find our last 3-year budgets. And I'm going to click on it for just a second. So if you haven't seen it, it's about, every year, it's about 55 pages long. I think it's the most transparent and thorough government budget I've ever seen for an agency of our size. It always starts with a letter. You just read this letter, you kind of will probably answer every question you have about it and how the costs are going up year to year. It also lists significant increases from last year. In addition, if there was any decreases, it points that out. And a lot of the things I already went through are found right in here. But I did want to point out something specifically. Those sections we talked about, they're all listed in here. So let me give you an example. So administration, it'll say what's going on, what the administration is, who falls under it. What were the accomplishments of the administration last year? What are the goals for this next year? It also says how many staff is assigned to this division and how that's fluctuated. It has a line item showing the last 3 years for all parts of the budget of this section. And if you're wondering what any of these are, they're indexed right here. So these all refer. So it's about as transparent as you can get with a government budget, I think. Everything is here. If you want to know how much we spend on uniforms, it's in here. How much we spend on gasoline, it's in here. And I won't bore you with going through 55 pages of this, but it is there and it's readily available. And hopefully, and then finally, I don't have numbers for next year yet. I'm in the very early process. I can tell you that the MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, is about a 3% COLA increase for all employees. That will be probably the biggest increase. I have seen the dispatch contract. It's a minor increase of about $10,000 for our 5 dispatchers that are up there. So that's good news. I have not seen our insurance and how much that's going up at this point, but those are usually the biggies. I did want to share just some goals that I have sketched out for this year and maybe into next year. Similar to fire, I think we're in worse shape personally, because everyone still wants to be a firefighter, I feel like, but we're having a significant staffing issue. It started probably about 5 years ago. We started hurting. It picked up pretty dramatically in 2020. And now we're kind of in a tough spot. We have, just to give you an idea, we have 42 sworn officers. Those include me. Well, I'm not out on the street, but I am a sworn police officer, all the way down to the person who just got out of the academy. Out of those 42, 10 of us are assigned to administrative positions, investigations, or the task force. Those are your detectives, lieutenants, captains. So that leaves you with about 32 sworn to handle those 35 to 40,000 calls for service that come out. Those are 32 people to handle driving around in the black and white cars or on the motorcycles and actually going on calls and helping people and making traffic stops. Currently, of those 32, 10, we're down. I'll say we have 3 open positions that are not filled, but we're really kind of down 10, and I'll explain that to you. 3 officers are doing well, but they're in our field training program. That takes about 5 months to complete. So if you see 2 officers roll up in a car, that means one of them is on training. And we don't let them alone until they ride around with a veteran officer or field training officer for 5 months. We have 2 currently in the academy. The academy takes 5 months also. So just academy and FTO, you're looking at a minimum of 10 to 11 months before you're out on the street by your own. We also have 3 open positions that we're in the process of interviewing and hopefully filling. And we have 2 people on relatively long-term workers' compensation injuries right now. So as of today, we have 22 officers to handle those $35,000 to $40,000 calls for 40,000 calls for service. So one of their big goals this year is to myself, along with human resources, is to work closely with our 3 managers and brainstorm a bunch of ideas. We've been brainstorming and coming up with things for several years, including signing bonuses, including referral bonuses. If an employee finds someone who we hire, they get a little pay kick. We've been doing, we've done job fairs in the past. It's just not a very desirable profession right now for many reasons. And so that really hurts. And we really struggle, along with everyone in California and in the country. But we're in a unique spot in Marin County where I think it's a highly professional, highly educated county, and it just doesn't seem a lot of draw from within the county to want to be a police officer. Cost of living hurts a lot. Commute is not great. But anyways, that's one of our goals, is to really try and, take that head on. In addition, one of our goals is to increase training for all staff to include a lot of new state mandates that have come out over the last few years and expectations from communities. It's pretty much a money issue, and we'll be increasing our training budget slightly for that. I believe currently it's about $80,000 to $100,000 for training. We'll probably ask to bump that up $10,000 to $20,000. Our website, I already mentioned, we're looking to redesign that. Recently we were awarded a wellness grant, which is 100% basically free money to us for 2 years to work on physical and wellness of our employees. You know, physically well and mentally well staff make good decisions. So we're working on that. We've recently created a peer support team, which we haven't had for about 15 years. We're going to be doing mental wellness check-ins that's covered through this. And there's actually a wellness app that we purchased under the grant as well, where you can be very confidential and share things and things like that with professionals. And we're continuing to kind of slowly convert the fleet of our vehicles from sole combustion engines to either fully electric or hybrid models. That won't have any cost. It's just as cars reach end of life, we're not replacing any vehicles with sole combustion engines anymore. And then finally, we're in the process of implementing new SB2 legislation that mandates regarding the certification and decertification of police officers. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm available to answer any questions you may have.
Great, thank you, Chief Norton. Any questions from the council? Okay, yes, Councilmember Campbell.
Chief, thank you for the presentation. Appreciate it. My questions are similar to that for fire, is that my concern are the calls that come in for mental health related issues and the training that staff gets to make sure people, the officer in the field is aware of, you know, whatever mental health issues are happening and is handled appropriately. So I guess my questions for you are, what kind of training does staff get? Do you feel the budget that you have is sufficient to train them so that they can sufficiently handle these things? If not, what do you feel needs to be done so that you are comfortable that every staff member that you have that's potentially going to be called to these situations is properly trained to deal with it? And I guess my final question is, I'm assuming there's not somebody on staff that is kind of a psychologist, psychiatrist, somebody who's, you know, specifically trained for this. Do you think that that's necessary?
Sure. I can tell you just roughly last year, we haven't put out the report yet. Every year we average about 100 mental health holds, and that's where we evaluate someone and put them on a hold. Okay. And we usually have about 20 voluntary holds. That's where we ask someone if they we don't feel there's enough to put them on a hold, but they're kind of close. And we ask them if they basically like a ride to a facility, and 20 people roughly take us up on that offer. Let's see, where to start with this. I can tell you, so the way it works is if someone calls in and says, there's a guy on the street corner and he's acting strange. So that's all they say. And we like someone to respond. Okay. Generally, as you can tell by the calls of service, we give about 40,000 and fire has 5,000. Most of those calls are going to us. We'll go out there and it could be a guy who's just having a nice day and that's it. And, you know, we talk to them and that's it. It could be someone having a serious, you know, mental breakdown. In those instances, we may put them on a hold. As you can see, we put someone on a hold every 1 to 3 or 4 days against their will. Most of those go really smooth. Occasionally they don't go so smooth. And like the fire department, we have a thing called a wrap device, which it's kind of like a piece of canvas that's designed to wrap people so they don't hurt themselves. We also have soft helmets. It's kind of like a padded helmet if someone is, you know, attempting to bang their head on things and things like that. And in any instance like that, they would go to we would transport them to the ER to get medically cleared before we put them on a hold. But if it's a specific mental health call and it appears that way and dispatch and the call taker evaluates it, the first thing we do is try to use the county, gosh, I'm drawing a blank on it. Dan, give me the name for it right now. It's the county mental health mobile county
crisis.
There we go. They are not staffed 24/7, but that's always the first thing we do, is we reach out to them and see if someone's available. They may have someone working, but they may already be on a call in Novato, and then they have 2 more waiting. We use them first. If they're not available, then we'll go out and handle those calls. In terms of training, you get a little bit of a training in the academy. The one thing I will say that, and I can't speak for every agency I'm in, but I can tell you that within the first year or two, 100% of our officers get trained in specialized CIT training, crisis intervention training. Sorry, my cat thinks I'm talking to her. What that is that actually started, gosh, 21 or 22 years ago when I was a brand new officer, and it was unheard of in the country at this time. And it was put on. Marin County was the first to do anything like this, and it's still going strong today. It's a 40-hour training that's put on by, there's some law enforcement, there's a lot of mental health professionals. It teaches you not only about mental health and how it's important to not be afraid when someone's in crisis to put them on a hold because you're doing them a favor, like doing nothing, which was kind of, I guess, what happened a lot in the 80s and maybe the 90s, was not helping people because there was no one really looking out for them. So it teaches you that, it gives you a lot of empathy, and it even takes you around to, some of the shelters and things like that. And so we always have our new officers. It's good exposure for them to go through that training. And it really teaches you about mental health holds and why they're important and the right way to do them. That is the big training they get. In terms of continuing training, if we have on the past had brought in mental health professionals, but we do also do a lot of verbal de-escalation training that I think crosses over a lot into this. It's how to talk to people. And, I like to say, talk someone into handcuffs. It's always use of force is like the last option. And if you can talk someone into going along with you and realizing it's in their best interest, it's always a win-win for everybody involved. But yeah, I would say those are I think that, did I answer all of your question there?
Yeah, except for, you mentioned the 40-hour CIT training
Right.
and the de-escalation training. My question is, do you think staff would benefit from additional training? And is that something that is not in your budget that maybe should be in your budget? If it's, continuing every year, everybody has to do, a class on, some type of de-escalation, mental health training, something like that. Do you think that would be beneficial?
I think, we are asking to have our training budget go up this year. And, part of it is it's not the cost of the training, it's the cost of covering, it's the overtime, right? So you're having people to have to come down on their days off and you have to pay them to be there for the training. We don't have the luxury to really train on duty because we're just running around the whole time. I don't think we need more money in our budget, but I think, one thing we're starting to do is a really good resource is frankly, us and our fire departments have a lot of well-trained people, but they're trained in different areas. So we need to start, I think, cross-training a little bit more. We've trained them in the past about active shooters and things like that and how to respond with us if we have something like that. And they've trained us in basic first aid. But I think we can definitely do some cross training on, things like seizures, which we don't get, basic training on. We've done training in the past on it because it's become an issue, but that was nothing I'd ever even really heard of for my first 10 years until about 5-6 years ago. And then we're like, we got to train on this. I've never even heard of this. Right. So I think we can definitely do some cross training. I don't think we necessarily need more funding. We do have, I'll let you know that we are lucky in a way. We have kind of an agreement with the POA where it's either 6 or 7 days a year. Every officer has mandatory 12-hour training day with us, which is a lot for an agency our size. And instead of having to pay overtime, they'll work that shift in lieu of another shift. So, you know, they'll come in on a day off, but maybe that Monday they have an extra body, so they'll take that day off instead. It's pretty rare for a POA or a union to agree to something like that. They usually are like, no, you'll pay me overtime. But I think it does show over the years, the officers want the training and they're willing to meet us halfway. You know, I will say that some of the smaller agencies, they don't have that ability, and they might just get the minimum state training, just so you know. I think it's 12 hours every 2 years. That's it. One
So-
12 hour day.
So I guess my question, I am not on the police council. I'm not on the fire council.
Right.
My question is, this is important to me as a
Right.
council member, that our police and fire just trained to handle things outside, you know, your normal, there's a fire, there's a, you know, a bank robbery type thing, you know, this type of mental health training. Is there anything that we can do to, I mean, you said, yeah, it's not the funding that's the issue. That we can encourage this, that we can somehow stress that it's a priority that we would like to try to implement.
And I might be speaking out of turn, so cut me off, Manager Schwartz, if you want, but I would say you have a really good program in the county, this mobile crisis program, and it's perfect. Okay. Now, if someone has a gun or a knife, they're not going to respond without us. But they don't ask for us to even go. They're like, we'll call you if we need you. And we go, that works for me, because we can do what we're really trained to do and what we're paid to do. And fire can do what they're trained to do and paid to do. And you get a mental health professional coming. And I'll be honest, if it was my family member, that's what I would want coming. I wouldn't want a firefighter and I wouldn't want a police officer. But it's been something that was handed to us. You know, I think we've personally talked about this 40 years ago. You know, all the mental health got cut in the state of California, and everyone got basically pushed out onto the streets. It just needs some more funding, I think, to get to where it needs to be, so it can be a true countywide resource to handle these calls. In a perfect world, you know, in a really perfect world, we wouldn't even know of mental health calls unless we were really needed and it would be handled. It's a significant cost, probably. I know there was, I think, some very preliminary discussions at a manager's level, maybe a year or two ago. But did you want to chime in, Dan?
Yeah, if I could, thanks, Chief. A couple of things I'll offer, Councilmember Kendall, and the Chief and I talked about this quite a bit, actually. So there were some discussions by the managers about how to increase the resources of the mobile crisis unit. And I think two things happened. One is it's a lot of money. So there was a discussion of how would it get paid for. But below that is there's not consensus on what exactly that unit's supposed to do. For example, one of the things that some of us might debate is, what does it mean to be put in a hold? In our county, it means you can walk right back out of the facility. So that facility happens to be right next to our city limits. And so a lot of times our officers are the ones who have to go find the person because they're still in crisis even after they left the hold facility. So we've had trouble getting over that hump, and our leaders, our community leaders, probably need to start talking about what are our priorities in how we handle this crisis. And those are really tough conversations, and there's great arguments on both sides of the equation for how we handle these individual cases. If we can get through that, I think then we can solve. It's almost like we worked the problem backwards. We tried to solve a funding problem without having defined what it is we were going to go fund. And so I think that's where we could use a lot of help, is maybe some convening among our countywide leadership groups. So this is a priority, and how are we going to tackle it as a group? Because we're all too small. Even our two big cities, big quote unquote, aren't that big, right? So none of us really equipped to fund this type of thing ourselves. But as a county, I think we could pull something off. And then the other thing, this is a lesser thing, but it's a thing that I've been noodling around and heard both chiefs talk about it. We probably need to do some education campaign for our public about telling the dispatcher why you're calling. I've actually recently had reason to hear from the chief about some very specific dispatch calls, and folks are not always as clear as they could be. And I realize people are stressed when they're making those calls, but the dispatcher is making a huge judgment on who's supposed to arrive at the scene. And it almost always, if I'm not sure, I'm sending a police officer. And maybe if we had a little better protocol there and we were educating the public that, be really specific about what you're calling this to ask for would be helpful. So there's my 2 cents on that.
Can I just,
Yes, please.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, Chief, but our conversations that I've had with you is, and I think this is important when we talk about mental health and interventions within our community. It's not always the person that you may see acting acting out behaviors on a street corner or causing a commotion or something. Very often they're interpersonal family dynamics that our law enforcement get involved in when they get called to a home where there might be a suicidal teenager, there may be an older adult who is suicidal or who is having behavioral problems within the structure of their own home. And I think a lot of these calls, and I don't know the breakdown, really are not in the public eye, but it's our law enforcement have to engage within our interpersonal relationships within our community, within their home. And it's striking how many of our young adults in our community are really struggling with their mental health. And they've been struggling even bigger since and more dangerously since the pandemic started. So I know that that's all wrapped up into this. And I think the more we can support our young people too, within the programmatically within the community, the less intervention they need to have law enforcement does with them. So my 2 cents worth, Chief.
I think that's pretty accurate. I would say at least half, if more, maybe it's more like 2/3 or 3/4 of those 100 holds is unfortunately ideations of suicide or an actual suicide attempt. That's the bulk of it. And those are obviously the saddest, but and we do have quite a few youth that we have to put on holds, unfortunately.
Thank you. Anything else from, yes, Councilmember Carroll.
I assume as on a countywide level, all the chiefs get together on a regular basis. You have your own
Yes, monthly.
equivalent to our equivalents of,
Right.
yeah. And I'm just curious if the association, if you've thought of putting together the numbers that your individual departments are currently responding to. And I think this is kind of a natural, given the cost per hour of putting a police officer on the street. I have to believe that an equivalent mental health professional, even being paid an adequate salary, some of which are not, unfortunately, but it would be a cost savings for all the departments. And not to mention a little better in that there are people that have consistent mental health problems. I have an older son who would have been referred to previously as a frequent flyer, and the San Rafael police got to know him so well they could actually judge how many officers needed to be there when given his state of mind, whether one officer could deal with him on one-on-one basis or whether it might need 1 or 2 backup just in case. There's a lot of instances where just an officer talking to him was enough, and it just always struck me, the cost per hour for that police officer as opposed to a mental health worker, it's just the economics alone, I would think, would drive it.
Yeah, what you have, I think, is you may have an anomaly with like a San Rafael, who a lot of services are in downtown San Rafael, and it draws people who need those services. And for them, it's kind of a no-brainer to have someone or to contract with a company because it's such a huge amount of their time they spent. Whereas with us, the calls are significant, but we don't spend a ton of time on it. Like I said, we had about 100 holds. And then if you look at a Ross or a Fairfax or a Bell, I don't even know how many they have, probably very few, right? It really is. I think it's a problem that affects everyone. And I think it's it would be great to get, some sort of countywide solution on this and not look at it just as our own little kingdoms, It's not really a chief level thing to handle. It's a manager, council member, supervisor type deal.
Well, no, I just meant as far as give us the information.
Oh, yeah. Well,
So
I
that
think
we could look
they-
at the statistics and say, look, this is obviously a countywide issue that for all of us, it's better to deal with on that level. We can't just walk in without the numbers
Right, I got
to
you.
back us up, is what I'm
And,
trying to say.
there's a lot of it's interrelated too, right? We may go out to a homeless camp out in the marsh and it's a homeless camp issue, but maybe one of the people there is, having a lot of mental health problems. It might not be to the point where they need to be put on a hold, but if it was a psychiatrist or psychologist out there, maybe they could, help them a little better than we will. I didn't mention that about 3 to 5 years ago, I created a little at no cost, and I created a little group of 4 or 5 officers, and they're on what's called the Hope Team. And I give them a lot of extra training on resources and things to provide people that are homeless, and they're very familiar with the ones living in our jurisdiction, and they do occasionally go for hikes out in the woods or marsh and try to assist people as best they can, and most importantly, link them with professionals and resources and get them into temporary shelters and things like that. So it's not always a mental health issue, but there's sometimes some overlap there too. And, that's another thing where I think surprisingly, I think there's more county resources, in my opinion, for dealing with homelessness right now than there is with mental health. And they both need to be solved, right? But, I'm not sure. I think they at least need equal weight, for lack of a better term.
I understand.
Agree.
Yeah. Well, I think the big issue is that, it's not, the police officers have more than enough responsibility as it is, and to keep on top of the mental health services, which do change. Believe me, I do follow them in the county, and it's difficult for me to keep up with the changes in the program sometimes. So it's just, I think it's something, if you as an organization could come up with the numbers, I think that would help us greatly in trying to accomplish that.
I don't think that's too hard. Maybe we could get some direction from the managers group, and they could push that out, and their chiefs could run the numbers or something like that. Yeah, I think it's important for us to still have the ability to put someone on a mental health hold, but we should probably be the second or third option. You know what I mean? Something like that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Any other questions?
No, I think I'm anxious to get on with the rest of the meeting.
Okay.
Sorry
Okay.
if I was long-winded.
Yeah, I think we have in the public raised hands. So Allison, if any questions for the chief?
Thank you. Our first comment will come from Lilia Langto.
Welcome.
And Lilia, I'll ask you to unmute. Oops. I'll try asking to unmute one more time. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem as though they want
Okay.
to respond.
So I'll just one more. Anybody in the chamber have any questions, comments? No. It looks like she's unmuted now.
I removed her permission to speak. That's why the microphone went.
Okay. Okay. So if there are no more comments, then I did have one minor question about fire evacuation. If you could just say generally, I think that's one of the pieces of what you're working on, and any status on that.
Yeah, we're working very closely with our 2 fire agencies, Central Marin and Ross Valley, and we have been, frankly, we were a little, I'm not gonna say lackadaisical, but it wasn't really at the forefront until, about, what was it, 5 or 7 years ago now. And I think one good thing that came out of that is all your first responders, most of them live up in Sonoma County. So a lot of us evacuated or were on standby, and some people lost their homes, right? And it was a wake-up call is, we're like, well, this happened here, this could definitely happen down there. But Chief Martin and I are always in close correspondence in that. And I can say for Larkspur, we work closely with the NRG coordinator. You know, she'll call me up or call Chief Martin and go, hey, I have an idea for this. And a lot of times I go, that's great, but you know, what'd be even better is why don't you do this? So you get more participation in what we need. I don't have any, you know, real profound things to say on evacuations at this point, but I will say it's one of those things where if I have the soapbox, just wait until you're given direction. If you can leave, you know, normally, but try not to panic, because generally you are going to have, on almost every fire, you are going to have a lot of time. And, you know, for what it's worth, in 22 years, I've seen a lot of fires. We saw the one on Palm, right? I think we only had to evacuate like, you know, 4 or 6 houses on that one. It wasn't a massive thing. And that was a big, nasty fire too, with a lot of trees nearby. And that's the one thing that Ruben's taught me. And I've gotten to go on, I go out on every fire if I'm in there because I want to see it. Because it's really surprising to me how slow most of them spread and how hard it is, and what a great job the fire department does. And my whole career, I can only think of one time where I actually saw 2 structures burn when one caught. Every other time they contain it to one. And I think that's a testament to their training and abilities.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for the presentation and for answering all our questions tonight.
You're welcome. Have a good night.
Good night. Okay, so with that, we'll conclude our first business item and move on to our second business item, which is the consideration of whether to add city offices and multipurpose space to the scope of the current phase of planning and development for the commons. So if we could have a report from our city manager.
I'm going to invite the Public Works Director, Julian Skinner, to come up and join me. In the interest of time, I'm not going to belabor the written staff report, which I think comprehensively covers the discussion this evening. But for the benefit of the public, as a brief summary, it's now more than 18 months ago that your Public Works Director informed you that the conditions in the building are deteriorating at a rate that we either need to commit to rehabilitating this building or we're going to reach a point where we're going to have to red tag ourselves because the building's not going to be safe. Council's heard me say a number of times, probably the trigger condition is the elevator, because we've now been put on notice that the elevator repair company can no longer repair this elevator, and the next time it breaks, it's broken. So with that said, we have some pressing need to make some decisions, and we've raised over the subsequent months the questions of whether city offices should remain here, whether the city council chamber should remain here, if these uses should be moved elsewhere. And through those conversations, we've discussed quite a bit whether or not they should be moved to the city's parcel at the corner of Doherty and Rose Lane in conjunction with moving the library. And so that's what Julian's going to present, is sort of where we are in that discussion. But I want to add one thing that's not in the report before I turn it over to Julian, and that's Julian and I are now knee deep in infrastructure planning for 1 year out, 5 years out, 10 years out. And we need this decision for a reason I didn't put in the staff report, which is I'm realizing it's constraining or bottlenecking the way he and I are going to plan out the money with the administrative services director. So we kind of need to know where money needs to go and what we're going to be spending on these questions that are in this report, because it actually helps us start to look at how we're going to finance a whole host of other infrastructure questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julian. No pressure now. And I know he has a brief PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of council, members of the public. Julian Skinner, I'm the Public Works Director. So I do have a couple of slides here just to summarize some of the information that's in the staff report. As a city manager mentioned, this issue has been before you a number of times before, going back over a year ago when we first talked about conditions in this building, and then concurrently as we got the library grant and we got the funds from the community from the Commons Foundation for building the new library. It opened up an opportunity to look at what we should do with the future of city offices, given the condition of this building. There's just a handful of times that we've been here before. And so as we presented to you last time, we're primarily looking at a couple of options now. One is, given the condition of this building, it needs some work, and we believe it needs a significant renovation, what I would actually call a rebuild. Pretty much everything in this building should be replaced and rebuilt from the ground up. And so we've got some updated cost estimates here. I'm still showing a range here because we're very preliminary in this conversation. We haven't done any planning for what this building would look like in the future if it were to be city offices. And so we're showing a range of 12 to 18 million. There's also a lot of unknowns with this building and what should be kept and how a contractor would work on a building on this small of a site. So we're showing a budget range of 12 to 18 million. That would be for renovating this building, basically completely rebuilding it, and having it be essentially like a new building. So this is a big number. This is not a remodel. This is not a come in and fix this and fix that and replace a few things. This is getting you back in this building and for 50 to 100 years, as you would get in a new, if you were to build something new from scratch. The option 2 here, as we've mentioned, we're moving forward with building the new library over at the Commons. There's an opportunity while we're building the library to add another building or expand that building to accommodate city offices and some multi-purpose space too. And so in looking at somewhere around a 5,500 to 6,000 square foot second building with the library, a budget number for that is about 8 to 10 million. And so that's about half the cost of what it would be to redo this building, but it's more than half the footprint. And so I'll show you some of the numbers and a little bit of how we get those numbers. And then the other thing to consider is if we do decide to relocate the city offices, administrative offices functions over to a new building next to the library, then obviously we have this building still to consider what do we do with it. If we're not going to completely rebuild it and reconstruct it for city offices, then it's no longer that $18 million project. And then it really depends on how much work would you want to do to this building, depending on what its future use would be. Obviously, the more you would do to it, the more attractive it would be for another use that would come in or some other city use that we would find for it. But at the same time, you don't want to do, close to that 18 million because that may preclude somebody's use of the building. So, there's a whole range of costs that you could put in this building, depending on whether you wanted to fix the shell, kind of make a vanilla building. So somebody could come in and configure it how they best wanted for their purpose. But you'd also have questions such as, would we do some of the big expenses like the elevator? Well, maybe somebody would come in and they would have thought, I could have done something good with that building, but I don't like the elevator there. I would have put the elevator, in the back. And then you're looking at money wasted. So, these are very high range numbers because there's a lot of variables with this building, whether we stay in it or whether it gets repurposed. So one thing we have done is we've gone back, and even though I'm showing you big budget ranges, we have gone back to our consultants and tried to update the cost estimates. And there are some changes versus the last estimates that we presented to you were generated about a year ago. It's towards the tail end of COVID impacts. And so actually some of the costs have gone down a little bit. There were a lot of factors that were built into the costs during COVID, based on what the trends were at the time. And so the new numbers that we're getting back now that are reflective of the cost today for a new building is about $950 dollars a square foot. This is just, excuse me, this is just the construction cost. So there's soft costs on top of that too. And then the complete renovation or rebuild of this building, they're estimating at about 1,080 square feet. And so what we're showing here is that what our consultants are telling us is it's more expensive to rebuild something inside of this building on this site than it would be to build on a brand new site and a new building. So those are updated per square foot cost estimates.
Julian, I'm sorry. Can I just ask a question? The new building cost estimates.
Yes.
My recollection is when we were talking about building the library, there were different types of buildings that could be considered, whether it was a prefab or, architecturally, built from scratch. That 950, what is that? What type of building is that?
That is a new, what I would call architecturally designed building that would have a 50 to 100-year life.
And at
So
that point, is that the plan for the library? Because we're obviously going to want it to match the library with the funding that we have now. Is that what we're talking about for the library?
Yeah, so that number, the 950, is to do another building on that site that's the equivalent of what we're going to do with the library. Yes.
Thank you.
And as I mentioned, there are some soft costs, there's design costs, there's escalation because we wouldn't be under construction for a year or a year and a half, and then contingencies. And so just some data that the consultants provided back to me, the basis for these numbers, some nearby projects. The Twin Cities Police Station, it's a little bit old, it's over 10 years ago, but there are escalation factors that we can extrapolate and look at what that would cost today. So that's on the low end, that's about $800 a square foot. The Novato administration building in downtown Novato is about double the size of what this building is, and it came in at about $825 a square foot. And then just the most recent number, and probably the closest square footage wise, is the Corte Madera City Hall that was awarded last year. That's a complete remove and rebuild, and that's about $975 a square foot is what that project was awarded at. I did take some of the bid numbers are a little different than the numbers I represent here, because some of these projects had site work in them that we wouldn't really have if we were to redo this building, and we're carrying that number separately for the city offices if they were to be over at Rose Lane. That's a separate number. If we did extensive landscaping, those numbers are not in here. Like, for instance, the Corte Madera City Hall actually has a pretty extensive concrete plaza that's going with it. That number's taken out of what you see here, so it's a true building cost. And the other thing, I have an asterisk next to the Novato administrative building, because they actually did both of the things that we're looking at. They did both options. They took one of their historic buildings and they renovated it. They basically rebuilt it from the inside out. They actually repurposed that portion of city offices into their new council chambers and some support rooms. And then a few years later, they built a brand new from the ground up city offices. And so when they did the remodel or the renovation, it was a smaller building, but that number actually came out to closer to $2,000 a square foot when they did that building. That also has quite a bit of site work in it, so that number is probably a little bit on the high side. But that compares to the $825 they paid for a brand new building. So the two options, I'll just go over the bullet points here quickly. So the option one is if we renovate this building, the most recent cost estimate for Kitchell, if it were to go out to bid today, knowing what they know, and there's some contingency allowances in there for unknowns, they would expect it to come in at about 15.3 all in. So that's all of the soft costs. That accounts for all your engineering, all of your design work. They would anticipate about $15.3 million. And again, we've recommended if we're going to move forward with this, we should keep in mind that we may need up to $18 million. And again, this is a complete renovation of this building. It is not, we've done a number of remodels, I would call them, and upgrades on this building, but they're not complete rebuilds, which is what we would recommend if we want to be in this building for 50 to 100 years. You're basically, it's like building a new building inside of the shell. The other thing with this option is it does require a temporary relocation of staff. So we would not do that extensive of a project in this building and keep staff here. Even if you did half the building, it wouldn't work. I wouldn't recommend it. And so if we were to undertake this project, it would require moving staff out somewhere, housing them for 2 years temporarily, and then moving back in when we were finished. That cost is not in the budget up above, nor is renting that space. And again, you're constrained at this site. it's a small site land-wise compared to the size of the building. That's what is driving some of these costs up, is if a contractor will come here and do that size of a project, they don't really have anywhere to work from. There's nowhere to get material delivered. There's nowhere for their workers. And so it's doable, but those things have dollars attached to them and it makes the cost of the project go up. And at the same time, it limits what this final project could be. We're not going to get the amount of parking here with a remodel that we could get over at the Commons, for example. It's just not doable on this site. So while it will be a brand new building inside of this, there are limitations on what we could deliver at this site. And again, the caveat is that's a complete rebuild. Those are the numbers we're sharing with you. You could do something less. You could do a lighter renovation of this building, but you're not going to get a 50 to 100 year. And the lower you bring that number down, the more is the increased chance that something else could go wrong with the building that'll either keep costing you money down the road, or as a city manager mentioned, if we take a risk and we think the elevator is not worth upgrading, if we lose components like that, then we lose functionality of the building. And if it takes a long time to get a new elevator, then you've got issues with relocating staff and things like that that wouldn't have been unplanned for. So option 2 is the building the new admin offices and some multi-purpose space at the same time that we build the library over on the same parcel. Their latest cost estimate for that today is $8 million all in. Again, we've got a recommended budget of up to 10 for that project. That doesn't have as many unknowns. It's a brand new site, so it won't have as many unknowns. And so, but it's still, at this point, we haven't got the design yet. We're still going through the RFP. So that these numbers, the total project cost and the recommended budget, those numbers will grow closer together as we move forward with either one of these projects and we get more information and we have the consultants looking at existing conditions and we figure out what we want the new buildings to be and look like and how they want to function. And so this number also is a one-time number. If we decide that we don't want to do this at this time, but we still may want to have a new city offices in the future, there's probably, you tack another $1 million on this right away because you're going to lose the cost efficiency of building this at the same time as a library. Plus, on top of that, whatever escalation factors as you push the project down the road. So this number here does account for the fact that it would be part of a larger project and the square footage numbers will be a little less. What this doesn't include is whatever we determine we need to spend on 400 Magnolia for whatever happens to it after city offices move over to the new building. So whatever costs are required for the work in this building is not part of that $8 million there.
Julian, if I may ask at this point, is there an estimate of what those cost savings are by doing the buildings together? So let's say that we did decide later, 2 years from now, to do it on Rose Lane.
So there's two components to it. One is the economies of doing the two projects together, which Kitchell have estimated in the $1 million range. So that's $1 million today that we know this would cost more. The other is escalation. And so escalation is kind of all over the place and it has been since COVID. And I think when we gave you the numbers before, we were looking at about 17% escalation, and the escalation's been dialed down to just under 10%, I think, for putting this project out a year to be built. So if escalation continues like that, then you add another 10% on each year you push it out. If escalation smooths out a little bit, then that doesn't. But the actual not building at the same time of the library, that's about $1 million just from that efficiency. And again, as we've mentioned, we're moving forward now with work to get an RFP and an RFQ out for building the new library at Rose Lane. Our consultants are at the same time queuing up to have the city offices as part of that project. We're going to get to a point within the next month where that document needs to go out, and it's in our best interest to have that document go out how we're going to build. We don't want to go out with a library and a city offices and then a few months down the road, take the city offices portion out of it. Because once we're dealing with a contractor, everything's going to get more expensive if we make changes down the road. So it's really important that when this RFP goes out, that it's focused on we're building a library or we're building a library and the city offices. And we're about a month, sometime in early April, we want that RFP to be out on the sort of the RFQ is the first phase. We want that to be out on the street. So we're really looking for a commitment if we're going to build at the Commons, then we would need to lock that in by the end of this month so that the RFQ can go out and we can have the contractors start to put their information together for what the project is going to be. And I guess that was the last slide. So I'm available for any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. So council members, Councilor, I think you were first.
Thank you, Julian, for that and how concise and the staff report was very elaborate. So appreciate that. Just to get this started, one of my key issues with civic buildings is accessibility for our community, for people with mobility issues and for our senior community and our children. So question about option 2. So option 2, should we pursue option 2? We have decided that the new library at the Commons will be a single-story building. I understand it's not going to be a double-story building at this time. That's a decision that's been made. So my assumption is that the administrative offices will also be single-story buildings that we're looking at. So, and hence not the need for an elevator. Am I correct with that?
Yes, that's the footprint that our consultants are working with at the
Oh,
moment. Yes.
Okay, because an elevator is an essential part of this building for any accessibility to this level that we're sitting on, or from the level from into the children's area, which will not be the library, but that level of our community. Okay, so option 2 allows us a structure that has greater accessibility opportunities, is what I'm looking at. The second question is option 1. I know in our housing element, I'm pretty sure it's there, the potential future development of the parcel of land to the north of Station 15, which also I understand the parcel goes back pretty much to the dirt parking lot of our to the back of our building here, right? Which we also have a few spots of city parking in them, or employee parking available. My question really relates to the fact that our parking is already constrained here, and we only really have 3 spots, 1 disabled parking, a few in the back. And then if there's any future development for the parcel that's to the north of our Station 15, we could even have further constraints of parking here. Hypothetically. Is that hypothetically, is there potential that we could have even more
So-
constraints?
You're referring to a gravel lot that's up
Right.
the lane here. We pay rent and we've been put on notice that our lease will be terminated when the development's done. So that doesn't yet have an exact timetable, but I'm under the impression, regardless of what happens, we're going to lose that additional parking in 2 to 3 years.
And at this point, I think it's 4 or 5 parking
It's-
spots.
It's 3 or 4 if we're creative. for
Yeah.
Our staff, yeah.
I'm just thinking of future implications for accessibility for parking for our visitors. Even if we don't have a library here, there is still no further additional parking available.
Well, your questions are leading to one of the things that also drives all these costs up, which is that the building has to come into compliance with the ADA.
Yes,
And very little of this building is in compliance with the ADA. For example, we've made reference to the elevator not being replaceable. Well, that elevator shaft, I believe I'm correct from talking to the engineer, isn't big enough to hold an ADA compliant elevator. So right there, that whole thing's gone. Once we have to replace it. If you go look at the master plan document, the design team who helped us with our master plan for the community facility parcel actually have an appendix where they talk about, well, what should happen at City Hall. And they point out that they can't conceive of really any way to create a proper ADA parking space and an ADA entrance unless you put it in the very back of the building.
Mhm.
So you're talking about a massive reconfiguration in the back just to accommodate the law. So that's just two instances. I mean, we're gonna keep having, these things are what Kitchell's adding into the calculation of what it's gonna cost to do this properly. You're probably gonna have fewer parking spaces to have proper ADA parking spaces
I
at the
think, yeah,
building.
yeah, and that's, I mean, I will talk more about this, but I just remember the conversation one time Theo Graft had with us in here, that just to remember 50% of our community lives on the opposite side of Corte Madera Creek. And to access and to use this building, they can't walk, they need to drive. And many of our seniors need to drive here. And I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that we need them to have opportunities to park safely and with sufficient parking to access their public spaces. So I'll leave it at that for now, but that's where I'm coming from on some of this.
Great, appreciate the comments, Councilmember Harif.
I really like that gravel parking lot. I park there every time I come to a city council meeting, so. I have to figure out something to do with it. I just have a question, because I just want to understand what's being compared in terms of the costs for these different options. And I understand that the cost projection that you've got for building a facility on, in the Rose Lane property, if you want to call it that. And I think you also made it clear that that cost is just for the building. So for example, if we were to build that building and we were going to renovate this building to an extent where it would be of interest to another use or user, how much would that cost? And shouldn't we add those costs together?
Well, we don't know at this point to what level we would upgrade this building. We would work with a consultant to determine. There may be people that would come in and say, don't do anything to the building because whatever you do, I may end up throwing away, and it will be most efficient for that entity to come in and start from scratch, start from their own blank slate, do their own seismic based on how they want to use the building in the future. So it really could be anywhere from 0 up to, I think you would have to spend 5 or 6 million in this building to get it to a point where somebody could come in and do what I would call tenant improvements, where they're just doing cosmetic stuff. Up to once you get up to 10, 11, 12 million dollars, and then you're doing most of the work for them, but you're also kind of dictating what the building's going to look like that may not be suitable with what that future use is. So there's a real range of unknowns and what that cost is to take this building to whatever its next life is.
Right. I guess the concern that I had was the way the costs are laid out in this presentation doesn't take into account whatever we would have to do with this building.
That is correct.
And if we assume that we would have to do something that might be in a cost range that you just described, about $5 or more million, in addition to the cost of building a new building, all of a sudden, this project is comparable in cost to the project on Rose Lane.
Yeah, but
What am I missing?
So we haven't talked about financing in a while, but one of the things we wouldn't know unless we were able to issue this RFP to ask about this building is who would come in and develop it, what sort of access they have to credit, cash, and financing, and how they would want a contribution from the city. For example, we could take all of our credit potentially in a negotiated ground lease where we weren't charging the occupant of the building basically anything for 50 or 100 years. That's a common government to government deal that's cut so that some other government entity who has access to money could come in and front the cash to fix the building. We just don't know that because we haven't gone out and solicited those types of proposals yet. So
Right. And I understand that. And I understand it's a challenge to put your arms around what some of those costs might be. I just want to make it clarify in my own mind and maybe in the public's mind, what's being compared here? I mean, we have a proposal for a new building and then something, but we don't know what for this building. But it will almost certainly have some significant cost associated with it.
Again, there's cash as a cost and there's foregoing revenue, which it could very well be that's all the city's cost would end up being, foregoing the income it might otherwise make off this building. That would actually be the deal I would most want to pursue. We will basically give you this building for nothing for 50 to 100 years, but you pay the whole thing. I actually think there may be some government entities who need space, who might and have better liquidity and better access to cash than we do. I'd like to, if you put me on that path, that's where I would want to go first. But again, if you want to talk cash, what Julian's given you is, and you're right, you're roughly the same cash amount. If you're going all cash in to renovate this building for 6 to 9 to make it more attractive to anybody as straight cash investment, and you're paying cash or financing out at Rose Lane, you're right. Then you're basically saying the costs are the same.
And that's all I was trying to get at, because I think that the way things have been teed up by just looking at the cost of building and not really taking into account what we may have to do here is like comparing apples and oranges. And I'm trying to get a sense of what we would need to do in order to make it more of a apples to apples comparison.
I appreciate that, but this is our fourth stab at trying to get to where we go find out one way or the other. And the thing to not lose sight of is what we've tried to emphasize is apples to apples on the outcome for what the city's providing to the public. And the apples to apples there is where you want the city offices to operate. Do you want them here or do you want them over there?
And that raises a whole other set of questions about what the public wants, what is appropriate for the city in conducting its business, lots of things, and also challenges to our historic downtown district if we don't make commitments to preserve this building in a way that is, I think, consistent with the community's expectations about what this community and downtown area looks like. So that's all. This is just, for me, this is just a question. I'm not making a comment one way or the other, but it did bother me a little bit that when we're just looking at the cost comparisons, that we weren't necessarily capturing all of the costs that might need to be expended. So that's it.
Okay, thank you. I just am minding the time. I know many people are in the public and have waited to speak. So the other council members, if you want to make comments, let's keep it brief so we can go to public comment as soon as possible.
If anyone else took over this building under any condition, a long-term lease or whatever, they're going to still face the same problems we would face as far as parking and ADA accessibility. And having seen, I mean, an obvious use, if this wasn't a government building, you've already mentioned it in the past, I think boutique hotel or maybe a restaurant. But it would be a people intensive, even if it was just office spaces, it's a people intensive use. I mean, other than maybe a storage facility where you'd only need 1 or 2 loading docks for people to bring things in and out. Otherwise, if it's a people facility, what makes it unattractive for us to leave something we've been in for 109 years also makes it very unattractive for anyone to move in here. They're going to face the same parking constraints that we've managed to live with up until now. And I think that has to be taken into consideration. The other thing, as I mentioned in the past, I'm concerned about the firehouse next door, particularly that it's not seismically safe or sprinklered. Having been through the Loma Prieta earthquake and having seen fire facilities where the firemen had to axe their way out of their firehouses because the framing had shifted on their doors. It really concerns me when looking at that assessment report that I gave back to Councilman Way. It's already number 4 on our capital expenditure plan, I believe. But it just states rather succinctly, it does not lend itself to a successful renovation. And it's beyond its useful life as a modern fire station. So at some point, it's going to be moved, or we probably will go to a different location. And as of right now, we have no plan for what to do with that building. And I'm just curious, what is the time frame on either renovation or removal of the firehouse? Are we looking at 2 years, 5 years? Could we end up with 2 empty buildings at some point in the near future?
Today, my belief is that we're about 2 years out from Central Maine Fire coalescing around a plan for the entire jurisdiction. You can't talk about any one of the 4 firehouses without talking about all of them. And so that's, I don't know if the chief would agree with me, but I think we're probably a year or 2 away from putting something out to folks with a plan, because we're still having to analyze. You've seen that the fire authority funded an assessment of the building's conditions. What next has to happen is you fund a study that says, what if there's only 3 stations? What if there's only 2 stations? What if they're moved? What if they're in the same location? What does that do for the coverage? That's the next study that has to occur. And then you have to marry those 2 sets of information together. It's a process that we're going through now, but that's why I think we're on a path. So then answer your question. I have a fear that's a staggering amount of money, because if you read the whole assessment report, all 4 of those firehouses have problems.
Yeah.
So it's probably a big conversation with the community. Fire, you've heard me say in other conversations, fire is insurance. So everybody has to decide how much insurance they want to buy. But we have to decide that as a community. And so that'll be a conversation in about 3 years with the community. So that puts us on track. Maybe we're doing something with the firehouses in 5 to 7 years, maybe.
Okay. But this one is in the worst condition of.
The oldest.
It's
Well-
the oldest, and it's probably, I mean, when I read the
It's
inch and a half on either side of the fire truck coming in or out, that just having driven trucks that are about the size of fire engines, that's frightening, among other things. That's just, another question I have is regarding, I'm still bothered by the fact that we're not including, possibly combining the Department of Works and Park and Rec, which I know are on school sites, and we have great relationships with the school district, but I think what Oak Hill is pointing to the future. But it will be, and it's already happening, I know, in South San Francisco. San Francisco's moving on a project, and I believe there's 3 in Alameda County where school districts are using their surplus, what they consider to be surplus land, for teacher housing. And given the economics, we're probably next to maybe Palo Alto, or, parts of the peninsula, we're probably in the same shape the school districts are as far as attracting talent. And teacher housing is going to be on campuses, is going to be a big thing in the future. So I'm wondering if it isn't worth, rather than depending on the goodwill of the school district, that we combine these offices, and wouldn't it actually encourage either better sharing of staff between departments if they were all in one location?
So we actually, for a long time, planned for recreation to be on the Rose Lane property. But the space constraints of the grant and the way we've raised the money haven't really provided the means to include the rec staff offices in that facility. We could build that into any plan, whether it's just adding it onto the state funded and Commons Foundation portion, or if we do the city offices, we bring rec over. We can do that. The downside to moving the rec staff is we manage the facilities on Hall Middle School's property, and we manage Piper Park. And so all the rental and all the concerns and complaints are immediately dealt with on site because we're on site. So if we're not on site, that will change. That dynamic, we won't be as efficient. So that's the one concern we have with moving the rec staff out of their position where they are now. Public Works is trickier because you're managing all the things that are in the corporation yard. And I don't know that a corporation yard is a compatible use on the Rose Lane site, but it would, but I don't know that it's efficient for us to consider bringing the engineers over only because engineer and the engineers work hand in hand with the maintenance staff. And so that one's probably one that should stay where it is. What we do now and would continue to do is when we're having office hours, we're open to the public, there's always an engineer on site, and we always build into our facility plan, whether it's here or if we were to move, that we can accommodate that engineer being on site for those times when the public's interfacing with staff.
Okay.
Okay, Scott, you had a quick one?
No, I actually am looking forward to hearing from the public, so I'm going
Okay,
to
me
reserve my
too.
comments until then.
Yeah, that's great. So anybody in the chamber like to make a comment?
Yes.
Dennis Gilardi, Larkspur resident. I'd like to point out some of the real estate economics. And that starts with the value of this building. This building is basically a 9,300 square foot office building. Office buildings have value based upon classification A, B, and C. An A classified office building in Larkspur in Marin County right now has got a value range of $400 to $500 a square foot. If this was an A class building, it would have elevators, it would have parking to get an A class building. And this size building would require at least 3 dozen parking spaces to be an office space. So in talking about other entities using this building, it's not, there's already a constraint that we've lived with for over 100 years of using this building. I go back to saying, we renovate this building. And one of my ideas was the library, so originally was chambers for the council chambers, and we had the fire department down there. This was the movie theater and the community hall that we're in. I'm not sure about all the ADA rules, but a simple idea is that this chamber gets moved down to the library, and this second floor gets renovated. And as Councilmember Carroll was saying, we could move public or move staff offices. There's 12 people that work in this building now, between upstairs and downstairs. Public Works has got 8 staff people the last time I looked. Yes, they have more people because they have field workers. Put our departments in one place for the public to have access to. Now, from ADA standpoint, we remodeled the library downstairs for council chambers that can open up the back very easily and get a ADA elevator access right off the back of the building. Parking is not going to change because it's constrained, but our community, our members We have not had a problem coming to meetings here. And this chamber here only holds 26 people. Anytime we have a major meeting, the biggest one's been held at Hall Middle School. And the reason for that is when Hall Middle School or in the school district offered their bonds or asked for us voters to approve their bonds, it was agreed that the Hall Middle School gymnasium would be used as a community center and meeting room. That's why our park and recs live down there, because that was part of the agreement. That they have offices. That the bondholders, the residents of Larkspur, all approved many years ago. So I think that we should take a serious look at what we want this building to be. If it's an office building to house city staff in the council chambers, then let's look at the costs. I heard $1 million potential cost savings right now if we go forward with a two-phase process, or the library and new city hall. I don't want to do anything to disrupt the movement forward for the library. Those contracts have already been let. The accounting systems have already been set up for it. Let that move forward. But take some time and make some decisions and get input from us about what to do with this building and how best to use it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next comment, anybody in the chamber? Oh.
Well, thank you for letting us continue to comment to you on our thoughts. I may say some things tonight that many of you won't agree with. I know there are a lot of different opinions on what should happen and when it should happen, where it should happen. I would just like to say that I believe that the city hall should remain here. It has served the city well over the years. And there's no reason, if the proper numbers are looked at and the proper realities are properly costed, that this couldn't be a very successful place for the continuation of city offices here. The other thing is that I probably have read everything that has been written about the property at what was called New Homes. And it was only in recent months when the future of City Hall was being discussed, that the idea of moving City Hall over to the TCF, that this really became a central subject of discussion. When the New Homes Company first started working on what's going to happen on the TCF, there was never any discussion that I'm aware of having the city hall occupy that space. I know many of the people who live in what was built by the New Homes Company. And there's, as anywhere else, there are different opinions on the best uses. But in my opinion, it would be totally unfair to all of the people who were told that there was going to be a library and a community center built, and that would happen according to the availability of funding to do so. And I think it would be reneging on the promises that were made until very recently. And I really urge you to not even consider putting City Hall on that parcel. There have been many things that have been examined as to where, yes,
Just about 10 seconds. Oops. Just about 10 seconds for your 3 minutes. If you can just wrap it up, we're just timing it.
it's already past my bedtime.
Okay,
And I'm,
30 seconds.
and I mean, I was not aware that we had a time limit.
Okay.
So I can assure you, I would like to get out of here just as much as you would. So I think there are many options for the City Hall to move anywhere that they want to. But I urge you not to even consider putting it on the TCF.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't think I have this lit up. I was using my watch. Okay, next comment, please. See if I can turn this on.
And I'm sorry, I just also want to make clear to everybody, we are having a time limit as we normally do for public comment. And the reason is we have, it looks like at least 20 people online. We want to give everybody a chance to speak. We don't want this to go till midnight. So we're just asking everyone to please respect that time limit. Thank you.
Larry Longto, 47 Meadowwood Drive. Before I say anything, I have read the staff report and I have burned in my memory the statistics about the space use here in City Hall, present City Hall. So before I make a comment, I have a question. And the question is, what is the square footage of the area of the library when it's fully completed on the commons?
6,845 square feet.
And the square footage that I hear of the proposed city space would be 5,500. Is that what I heard Julian say?
Yeah. But that includes increasing the amount of programming space available to the library because there'd be a lot of shared multi-purpose space.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the library size and somebody like this. At the beginning of the drive by the Commons Foundation, there was discussion and drawings made of a library on the Rose Lane site that would be 10,000 square feet. And I would like to just comment a little bit about that. I was on the city council at one time. I have been on the library, Larkspur Library Foundation for a long time. And in the year 2010, Bill Howard, a former council member who's here tonight, spoke before me, and Don Graff suggested that the foundation spend its own money to do a space needs assessment. We did. We did it in 2010. It was done by a professional. It was done by Page and Morris, by Kathy Page. She's now retired. I have a copy of that report I'll refer to in a minute, but it's important. So it's important because the people who heard that are no longer where you are. The city manager was Gene Bonander. So there's no historic memory or institutional memory among the people that heard that. So there's a way of computing what the size of a library should be. And I'm not going to get into the detail or into the weeds about that, but the simple way of thinking about it is it's 1 square foot for every resident of a community which that library serves. Kathy Page concluded that looking out to 2030, a library for Larkspur that would properly serve it should be 12,500 square feet. It's based on her looking at national library construction figures at the time this was done, looking at the state of California State Library Board for figures, and also looking at the Portola Valley Library that was built at 0.95. So this statistic has validity among the experts. And I say that because if you build a library that's 5,000 or 6,000 square feet, you'll find reading this that there's an efficiency factor that you arrive at for what is really the library that's used by people. And the space that's used for HVAC, elevators, if there are any, all those things that are not really devoted to library service, about 25%. So if you build a 5,000 or 6,000 square foot library, you take off 25%, you're going to take off, I'm trying to do the math mentally, but you're going to take off
So if you-
another 1,250 feet,
Yeah.
and you're going to be back down about the size of the library you currently have. Is that what you want? Is that what the community wants? I'll send each of you a copy of this study, and I'll just make it easy for you to give you those pages. So that's the first thing.
Sir, we're well over 3 minutes. Can you wrap it up?
Yeah, okay, I can wrap it up. No mention in the staff report about looking for money for historic preservation funds that could be used, because this is a historic building. It contributes to a historic district. That should be done. I want to second the comments that were made by Bill Howard, but in a different way, about the expectations for what goes on Rose Lane. And there were meetings at the community police center in 2012, and the city council passed a resolution saying that, and it's still in effect, saying that the community facility, as referenced in the ordinance approving that property, the community facility that justified an increase in density was going to be a library, not a library in City Hall. Okay, so in conclusion, I support what Bill Howard says. I support what Joan Lundstrom says. And I think if you do that and restore this historic building in a way that really does justice to it, whatever the use is, you and the city and its citizens will come out happy with that, as long as the library that is built that also lives up to the expectations of what people have been told. That's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else in the chamber, please? Yeah, and again, if you can try to keep it to 3 minutes, because we really want to hear from everybody.
And I'm just going to point out that the timer has some lights in it for the people speaking. So I think when the yellow light goes out as a green light, I think the yellow light says you have 30 seconds left. That's kind of a clue to that time's coming. Okay, thank you.
Hello, Mr. Cunningham. So lovely to see you.
I'm Richard Cunningham, a Larkspur resident, almost 50 years. My wife's reminded me that I've spent a good part of my professional life inside this building. I served on the Planning Commission, on the council, on the Heritage Board. In 2013, we had a party in this building to celebrate its 100-year anniversary, and I was able to give a talk on its history, which then was considered Larkspur's greatest accomplishment. I think we all understand this building stands as an extraordinary symbol of our community. This building has been asked to do many things for our little city, not only housing our offices, but including operation as a movie theater and dance hall, a firehouse, and a library, all at once. This city hall can continue to do much more, and we need to embrace that potential. The Smithsonian Magazine just published a great article on the famous Erie Canal, opened in 1825 and still operational today. The canal no longer carries heavy-duty commercial freight, but nevertheless remains in vibrant use. The Smithsonian observed, "What do we do with glorious things that have outlived their original intent? When we're wise, we preserve them." When we're brilliant, we preserve and repurpose them. I think our city residents deserve a brilliant solution. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I don't think you have to yield your 3 minutes if you want to comment as well. He was very, very concise. Okay, thank you.
My name is Hillary Culhane. I'm also a Larkspur resident, long time. Moved here in 92. I'm also the chairman of the Heritage Preservation Board, but I'm not speaking on the board's behalf. I just want to be clear about that. Brown Act is very much top of my mind. I just want to mention that there will be a meeting of the Heritage Board March 7th. And I've asked Elise to put City Hall on our agenda. So anyone that's watching this video now can make sure that you attend our meeting March 7th, because we will be discussing City Hall. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Next comment. Yep.
Tina MacArthur and a resident of Larkspur since 1985. And I'm also the board president of the Lark Theater. I believe in preserving these buildings. This is historical. This bookends the entrance into Larkspur, or the exit, as the Lark does on the other side. We cannot let this change. This is very, very important. And for 12 people, 12 employees to need a new place to work, to work, and have to build an extension or a new building at the library, the new library site, is criminal, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, any other comments here in the chamber? We'll come back to if you still want to speak. Allison, who's in the queue?
Will be Joan Lubomirsky.
Welcome, Joan.
Hello, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. Actually, we're having technical problems on Francis Avenue. So my former mayor and my former colleague, Joan Lundstrom, is here as well. So Joan Lundstrom will speak first, and then Joan Lubomirsky will speak. And I will be shorter so you can give her some of my time.
Okay, welcome, Joan Lundstrom.
Thank you. I have a problem with the city's discussion to date. Because integral to your whole discussion, besides the dollars and cents and the buildings, is if you make the decision to move City Hall offices, everybody asks, what happens to City Hall? You were going to put that civic discussion off until sometime when you have an analysis of options. That discussion needs to be part of what you're talking about right now. And when, pray tell, were you going to reach out to your own preservation board about that? And tonight here, I hear that if the City Hall has to be vacated, that's in a year and a half. This discussion is a now discussion. And besides, look at your banner in the back. You'll have to change that whole banner. Unless you, at some time, and I ask you now, that you recognize this historic, very unique City Hall. And as Tina MacArthur said, it's a landmark with the other landmark at the end of our historic downtown. And it's part of the reason we're on the National Register of Historic Places. So what I'm asking you is that you, as a city council now, affirm in a resolution your intention to preserve City Hall as historic. Whatever else you do, that you affirm your intention. And not, and as somebody mentioned tonight, it's a somebody else might use it, don't know. This is a Manila building, which shook me up. So basically, bottom line, I would like to see you as a city council affirm that City Hall is going to be preserved, period. Thank you. Now the other Joan.
Thank you, Joan Lundstrom. Welcome, Joan Lubomirsky.
Thank you very much. As has been mentioned eloquently by others, Larkspur is part of our historic downtown. And it is really a symbol of our town. I mean, it's a point of reference, and Tina MacArthur said it so well with the Lark Theater at the other end. The notion that someone else would be in the building was kind of horrifying. I don't think another government entity will have the money to do it either. And again, they'll have the same constraints on parking and whatnot. And would a private entity want to rent it, like a facade, like Disneyland or something? I just don't think that is going to happen. So the question is, then what happens? Do we tear it down? I don't think that would be something that our community would support. I'm sure we would not. So what I'd like the council and the city to do is to make the effort for City Hall. This isn't 400 Magnolia. This is City Hall. And I think the city, the community did it for the library, and I think the community can do it for City Hall. And I urge that it continue to be a civic building, and where people come for some services, and I hope that you don't forsake City Hall.
Thank you, Joan. All right. Next speaker in the queue, Allison.
Next speaker will be caller 1402.
Okay.
James Holmes, Larkspur. I do know the City Hall needs help because I was the one who phoned in a week ago last Tuesday to tell the Public Works and police that woodwork was falling down being blown off near the library entrance. But anyway, several points. Number one, very significantly, the consultant's report says that the building itself is in reasonable shape. It's just that its systems are at the end of their life. Systems normally don't last as long as buildings. So this building has good bones. Number two, the city has already spent significant funds to rehab a significant portion of it, and that should not go for nothing. Number three, I think as Mr. Haroff mentioned, you can't really compare just a new city hall with rehabbing our current city hall. You have to look at a new city hall versus rehabbing versus also making pre-rental changes to our city hall. And when you compare those costs together, they are pretty close. Now, I think that leads to a couple of points. Number one, if you put out an RFP, it needs to include both a new building and pre-rental prep or other reuse for City Hall. They could be different RFPs and they could be different bidders, but you have to ask about both and you have to get specific quotes for both. Otherwise, you will not have the full cost picture and you will be comparing apples and oranges. And second, the council should take advantage of what I understand has been the willingness of two community members who have extensive recent relevant real estate renovation experience with regard to historic or vintage structures on a business basis. And I am told that they are willing to evaluate the feasibility of rehabilitating City Hall. One of those two volunteers, I believe, is Mr. Gilardi. He can correct me, of course, if I'm wrong, since he's there. He recently completed a massive full rehabilitation of the downtown historic Victorian Red Robin building. The other volunteer expert that I'm aware of, I've forgotten his name, Mr. Gilardi has it, but that he is a senior executive of a major owner of Larkspur and Greenbrae vintage residential and commercial commercial properties. These local experts are not contractors. They would be like the city. They manage contractors to rehabilitate their vintage buildings, and they do it for a living. I think the willingness of these two local experts, if indeed this is the case, and I believe it is, to provide an evaluation is a tremendous community asset, which I think it would behoove the city to take advantage of and to explore, both in the interest of due diligence and because of the importance of this building to the community, which warrants not only reliance on outside consultants, but also community experts so that the community can have confidence that all avenues have been explored.
James,
Thank
we're
you.
over 3 minutes. Okay, thank you. Next comment, please, Allison.
Next speaker will be Sandra Goldman.
Okay.
Thank you. I would like to reinforce the comment that when an old and valued structure outlives its usefulness, that it be repurposed. I think it's fiscally irresponsible to try to retrofit the city hall to be a fully functional, fully accessible public facility. And I think the only responsible thing to do is to relocate City Hall to Rose Lane. And I'm speaking as a Rose Lane resident. The amount of traffic and noise generated by City Hall will be minimal. 12 to 15 people working there. Most applications are now submitted online. This is not going to cause parking problems, which is the great bugaboo for the neighborhood. So I urge you to do the fiscally responsible thing and relocate City Hall to Rose Lane. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Next speaker, please.
Next speaker is Ron Arliss.
Welcome, Ron.
Yes, good evening. As the two Jones, if I'd known they were having a party, I'm surprised I wasn't invited. As former council members who were present and did vote and did obtain the free land that we're all talking about. But it was done with the promise to the community and the commitment to the community that that land was only going to be used for a library and a community center. At no time did we ever say to the community, oh yeah, by the way, it'll also be used for government offices. I think it's irresponsible to switch that promise because that's how we got it as free land to the city. It's going to be used for the library and a community center only. But I would also like to say, I think Councilmember Haroff hit it right on the button. Even Julian's numbers show that you can't just look at option 2. Option 2 and option 2A have to be combined. And when you combine those numbers, the low end is 8 million for option 2 and 2A it's 6. Add those together, you get 14 million. The high end on option 2 is 10 million and on 2A it's 8. That's 18 million. So if you look at option 1, he's ranging 12 to 18. 2 and 2A are 14 to 18 million. Okay, so I think that you can't say, as the prior speaker just did, it's fiscally irresponsible to remodel City Hall. Clearly, these numbers are about the same, and I understand they're still up in the air, blah, blah, blah. But this is not an easy choice to say based on numbers. And the final thing is, as point brought up by the city manager, there's going to be some discussion in a year or two what to do with the fire station. Think about this creatively. Maybe it's time to think of these two pieces of land as one. Maybe it's time to think of to step forward on the fire station, and maybe it's time to move that out of there and then combine it with City Hall and something creative. I will tell you this, while I was on the council, We looked at the issue of response time. That's what really drives whether or not to close a fire station. And Chief Sinnott at that time said there would be no material change in response time if the fire station next door to City Hall was closed. So I would say do not get rushed into putting this out by the end of this month, and take this time to think about what the community really wants, which is to stay at City Hall. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. All right, next comment, please.
Next speaker is Chris Wheaton.
Welcome, Chris.
Thanks. I am a HOA board member for Rose Lane and also serve on the Partial Development Committee as chairperson of that committee. So I'm speaking initially as a representative of that committee and of the HOA, and just saying that we've voiced our traffic, parking, construction, kind of aesthetic concerns to Dan and also Julian and to Sky in both letters and in meetings, and we're still corresponding with them and waiting for a response on some of the issues that we raised there. I'd also mention that most of the members of the community were told when they bought their home that there would be a library, community center there. There wasn't really a discussion of city hall offices. So I agree with the other comments that there was a verbal commitment made to people when they were purchasing that this was going to be a library, and that was in part of the prior discussion. So this would be an expansion to what was contemplated there. All that being said, I guess I'm commenting now as a resident. I live at 53 Rose Lane in Larkspur, and I would say if there's a big fiscal reason to locate the offices there, that I personally don't feel compelled to say that as a resident that we shouldn't move the offices there. And I guess I'm having a hard time thinking about if you maintain the facade of that building, which I think the facade of the city hall is something that's worthy of maintaining. But we're able to sell to a private or public owner to be able to renovate it. It doesn't seem like there should be a cost to that. You have land, you have a building, you have a facade, and you'd have interested parties that might have an economic interest in renovating that. So I guess I'd need to know more about, from a fiscal standpoint, how that all would work. But it does sound like we have $1 million of savings of doing something now at the site, and we get brand new building, brand new offices at the Rose Lane site, and that has an appeal to me as a resident. And as a from your standpoint, the fiduciary responsibility to maintain the character of the town and maintain the facade while reducing the costs, that's appealing to me as a resident. So those are my two hats, and I'm all done.
Great, thank you, Chris. Okay, next comment, Allison.
For any further raised hands from our Zoom audience members? There's no further public comment.
Okay, so I'll bring it back one more time to the chamber. Any other comments here? Okay, well, let's bring it back to the council then, and any thoughts, discussion? Looks like we have a few options that have been laid out for us, and we can start thinking about what type of motion we might want to make.
I'll be happy to make a motion when people are ready, but I sense that they're not.
Okay.
But I will give you a heads up that my motion will be approved option 2.
Okay.
So so we begin the discussion. I think from what I've heard overwhelmingly is we do occupy a historic structure built in 1913. I read the book yesterday, Richard, and at a cost of $15,110, including the furnishings. This building has served the community very well for 100 years. $15,000 was a tremendous asset investment at the time, and I think it's served it well. I think affirming that this is a historic building is something that I would like to make sure we put forward, regardless of what we do with this building. It remains a historic structure for us. And we have many historic buildings in town, as Hillary can attest to. that the exterior remains historic while the interior has options to be upgraded. Putting that out there that I want everybody to know that I'm not in favor of getting rid of this building. I mean, this building is ours. It belongs to the town. It's been owned for 100 years. Repurposing it is another option, is another argument, is another discussion, but keeping the integrity of this historic structure, I don't think is up for debate at this point, from what I've heard. Anybody else want to challenge me on that?
No, I will agree with you on that.
On the exterior part of it?
Yeah, I think the comments that we have heard, I agree with the comments in general, which are this is a historic building. We are responsible for preserving downtown Larkspur. The bookends, I agree with all of that. The thing that I don't necessarily agree with is that we have to have chambers here in order to preserve downtown Larkspur. I think preserving the building in itself is the important part. And I think now that we are creating a new library at a different location, it is really an opportunity. And we have the economies of scale if we do these projects together to make not just one beautiful building, but two beautiful buildings, or one bigger beautiful building that is really going to benefit our community. I mean, it just feels like that is the right thing to do for a community at this time. I am fine designating this a historic building that, we can't change the outside of it without, whatever motion we would need to make sure that it's approved by, the design is consistent with what we want for downtown Larkspur. I completely agree with that. And I also, one of the things for me has always been the fiscal responsibility, and I disagree with I agree with the staff numbers that it will be a lot less expensive at the new location than to renovate this into City Hall again. And that there may be other solutions that are a lot less expensive that would still allow us to keep the exterior the way it is. And I would throw out there that we've been talking about the library for a long time. And there were some people in our community that said, you know what, we want this to happen. And, we're going to step up, we're going to form a foundation, we're going to raise money. And quite honestly, that's one of the reasons that this whole thing is happening, right? Is because we had a foundation that raised $5 million to move the library. And then we got a grant for another $5 million. So again, trying to be fiscally responsible for our community, it was a no-brainer. We get a free building. That's amazing. I would encourage people, if people have ideas what they would like to do with this building, and there's a groundswell, and people want to form a foundation to contribute funds to do something with this building, as long as it keeps the architectural integrity and it's consistent with downtown Larkspur. I would encourage people to do that. And, obviously that helps us. I think if we put something on the ballot saying, hey, we're going to, put a tax out there, a bond for $18 million to keep this building, I don't think people would do it. I mean, to keep City Hall here. I don't think people would do that. I think, people want us to be fiscally responsible. They don't want us spending their tax dollars if we don't have to. It feels like a way that we can save some tax dollars, get a beautiful extra building, and still preserve the, downtown Larkspur. So that's where I am right now. But again, I'm open to other people's comments and thoughts, and we'll take it from there.
Councilmember Carroll.
Sorry.
I'm getting the distinct feeling I'm the odd man out here.
No.
But I think, having heard from people who were here when this was initially, who go back a long time, and the promise was that the library would be moved there and possibly a community center. And I think that was, which is common in Marin County, that there be dual functions like that. And I take that word seriously. I wasn't here. I don't recall voting on it. I don't even remember I remember the Niven nursery very vividly, but I wasn't that involved with city stuff back then. And what I'm hearing from former council people just reiterates my feeling about it. Promises were made and we're altering that. And that disturbs me. I don't know. I assume the owners of the property who deeded it to us are no longer around, and so we don't risk a lawsuit on that issue. But I just find it very troubling that we're essentially backing away from a promise that was made. It was mentioned something about a resolution. Is there a resolution that was specific to this project that we have?
You got a couple of these there. You want me to? hit
The
them off already?
resolution went to more, is there a
I think the
resolution that was?
speaker was referring to a resolution that was during a period when a very specific version of the project was being talked about. So whether or not this council feels that that resolution binds them, I don't know. I know legally it does not, but if you feel it does politically, that's a different discussion you can have. But it's not a legally binding matter that you.
Well, we could overrule it. And if the majority are in favor of overruling it, could be.
And that
overruled.
goes to your other comment. So there is no deed. This was a development agreement. And so this land is owned outright by the city. And the requirement in the development agreement and the law that governs how that land was transferred is that it needs to provide a community-wide service. So as long as you're consistent with that legal requirement, these uses are allowed.
Okay, no, I wanted to make, that was the first I'd heard about a resolution being passed about it.
Yeah, the other thing I think is getting lost because we'd had an expedited beginning to this is the council's on its 5th major discussion about this topic over 18 months. And we've pointed out a number of times actually what Mr. Lankto brought out, which is we'd like the library to be bigger than what we're funded for. And a way to accomplish that is to bring over another project that can expand the number of multi-purpose rooms, because the missing component in my mind in the new facility is the expanded programming offerings that people will want. And so that was one of the discussion points in a prior meeting about potentially doing this, because we could marry money that we would invest in multi-purpose space to make it more compatible with the library. The other thing we had talked about is that the campus serve a disaster response purpose, and that requires more multi-purpose space than the facility is going to offer if it's a standalone library. Now, maybe you decide you want to stay here, that's fine, and then we'll have a separate conversation down the road about tackling those particular issues, but they are issues.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor Paulson?
Yes.
Could I just interject real quick to make a
Yes,
clarifying
please.
comment? Because Councilmember Way pointed out that I misspoke earlier.
The wrong number option. You were wanting number one.
I was thinking that the options, option 1 and option 2 were as they were laid out in the staff report. Not in the handouts. So I misspoke. The motion that I would propose to make is in the slide deck, option 1, not option 2.
Understood.
I would like to see this building maintained as City Hall, and I think our community wants that as well. So whenever you're ready for a motion, I'm happy to make it.
Okay.
So I'd like to kind of elaborate on what the city manager just spoke about, which I think goes to Larry Langto's question about the size of the library footprint that we're talking about based on the grant that we received from the state, which is very specific to what the footprint has to be for the funds that are coming from the state grant. But the opportunity, if we move office space and the collaborative opportunity to have combined spaces that are shared by the library personnel and the library patrons, and the office spaces, for instance, break rooms, bathrooms, shared large multi-purpose rooms that can be used for library programming, as well as city council programming, as well as Heritage Board, as well as Planning Commission. All of that expands the footprint space of community use. So although our specific grant has a specific square footage that is the minimum requirement, I envision the opportunity to bring office space there and the collaborative relationship to increase the space of community use of a library type of facility. Because much of what's done in libraries now that we have is programmatic things. It's having book clubs, it's having docent speakers, it's having toddler bouncing talk time with books, and all of that could be shared space for a council chambers or for book club things in a combined space. So I just think that needs to be clear, because that adds square footage to the potential for what is programmatically library function. Am I saying that correctly? I guess that's probably the best way I can explain it. The hybrid.
Yeah, I mean, that got a little lost because in the beginning, because that was a big conversation we had at one of your past meetings.
Right.
Was the compatibility of use. And it goes even further because if all the city staff is down there, then you have more managers on site to help administer the whole site, which is always going to be a challenge for us cost-wise with the library.
And with the small staff that we have, and I mean, that was a discussion we had years ago, whether we could do a second story. And a second story demands a tremendous amount of increase in staff to oversee not only the structure itself, but to make sure patrons are safe and to make sure that they're accessible. So we've already went through that whole discussion, but I just see the collaborative opportunity between office space that may not be utilized at 5 p.m. but could be utilized by other functions because there's a meeting room there, to be something that expands the use of our community space. So just to clarify that.
Mr. Mayor, can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
I just want to ask Councilman Haroff. So my understanding is that moving to this new location, there's a certain dollar figure attached to it, and staff has kind of outlined, if we were to do that, where that money would come from, where we'd be able to pull that money from to make this happen. I haven't seen anything that we have $18 million to renovate this building. And I'm uncomfortable voting for a resolution to commit to spending $18 million that we don't have. You know, and maybe I'm missing something and there's some money somewhere I'm not aware of, but I'm concerned about that.
I think the question to frame for the council is, at the end of March, will the RFQ contain the library or the library and the city offices and multipurpose space? The rest of these questions will follow in future discussions after you make that decision this evening. Because as we point out in the staff report, and you heard Mr. Skinner tonight, you could decide in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, now it's time, we've decided moving the city offices is the right thing to do, we're going to do it now. You'll just have lost an opportunity of $1 million.
Right. So it doesn't make sense. So the point is, if we can make the decision now, we should make it now. And the question on the floor is, Kevin, and, I obviously respect your opinion, is that, let's pass a resolution today, saying, we are going to commit to renovating City Hall and dumping $18 million into it. And my question is, I don't think we have $18 million to dump into this. I'm not sure. And again, anybody feel free to correct me, but, I'm not sure that I can commit to that right now.
So you have about 5 million, as we pointed out, in discretionary cash that's dedicated to infrastructure. In other talks we've given you, there's probably 3 to 4 million in various monies that you've tied up waiting to make decisions that kind of start to fall as dominoes after you make these preliminary discussions. So right there, you could maybe, depending on the policy choices you want to make, pull together $8 to $9 million in cash.
Which is the price tag for the new building at Rose Lane, right?
It is, and you may not want to dedicate all your cash to that building either.
But the point I'm saying is that, okay, so we have $9 million. One of the options is to make a $9 million building. Okay, good. The other option is to make an $18 million building. How's that going to happen?
So if regardless of how we resolve that first question of how much cash is going where, all these options result in some level of necessary debt service to complete, to get to the finish line. The quantity of that debt service will help determine where we have to go to get it. So, for example, your courtyard was funded on a private loan. It was small enough amount of money, and a private investor was willing to lend us the money because they felt the city was a secure a lending partner. That might be one example of one way we might go, if depending on what the amount is, just going to the private market. And we have a firm that helps us go figure out where all these different pots of money for debt service might be. You might want to issue certificates of participation or some other debt vehicle. You may want to do that. We'd bring you all of these different choices. So I don't want to suggest from anything we've given you that we can't figure out a way to pay for things. There's always a way to pay for things. It's always about how much cash you want to put into it and how much debt you want to put into it. So
Okay,
I just want to make sure.
Right, but okay, so but it sounds like for the building on Rose Lane, we have some pots of money we can go to. If we want to renovate this building, we don't, and we're going to have to borrow money, and we're going to owe money. We're going to have to pay interest on that money, and we're putting our city in debt in order to choose this building as opposed to that building. Am I missing something there?
Well,
I think you are.
Okay.
Okay, and let me explain my point of view on it. If you look at the options on page 2, we could have to come up with, to do Rose Lane right now, $10 million. How much of that are you willing to borrow?
Well, I mean, it sounds like we have $8+ million, available.
And the low number on completely renovating this building is 12 million. That doesn't necessarily mean we have to do the entire renovation at once. For instance, with the library floor empty, that could be initially the offices, and this space up here could not be touched until some point in the future when it's financially feasible to do that.
Can I ask
So
if that's
if
accurate?
5 years from now, we've paid off whatever it takes to do the initial renovation on this building, at that point, we could remodel the second floor. That's the obvious choice, because that way we don't have to worry about the elevator breaking down and using this as a public space. There are other public spaces we could use for 2 years in lieu of using this as a council chamber, be it at one of the schools or someplace else. So I think there are creative ways that we could make this building still useful without incurring a lot of debt. And the bottom line is, in the long run, if you're going to do Rose Lane and here, you are looking at $19-20 million.
No.
And
where do
I
you get
think we're
that?
still looking, and I still think we're looking at, the big thing that concerns me is the same reasons that we find this disadvantageous. Even though it's served us for 109 years, I don't see a private developer wanting this building.
We haven't even looked.
But I just, the exact same reasons were being given as to the negatives of this building that we've lived with for 109 years. A new person coming in is going to be looking at it in an entirely different light. They're going to be looking at it as either a 5-day, 8-hour-a-day facility that is constantly in use, which this floor is not. I mean, this chamber is not. They're going to want to be using this, 40 hours a week minimum. If it goes to a hotel, same issues. What are they going to do with parking for a hotel? I've seen what's happened at Caballo Point. That was supposed to be a no-car facility, and they quickly had to fold on that because nobody would stay there. unless they could bring their cars, I mean, these are the realities of it. And again, I keep going back to our point. We've lived with this building's limitations for 109 years. And I think we could be creative in making it work for the future.
Let me step in for a second. Well, I don't know, city manager, you had a comment to make. I'm mindful of the time, and I also I hear there's a lot of good discussion, and we should continue with some of that. I think one of the public comments that might be helpful in framing this is, would we as a council, affirm the preservation of this city hall in anything we pass? Because I've gotten the sense, the fiscal argument, the accessibility argument, I don't know that any member here believes this building should be torn down or that it should go into some dilapidated state.
No.
So, I mean, if there's so many unknowns here, and I'm hearing a lot of speculation now, but if we can agree that whatever we do with the, three options Julian has given us, that we, are we all committed to ensuring that this building remains? And we don't know what that means. I mean, I think that's what's making this meeting go later into the night is we're sitting with a lot of cards that we don't see and only a few that we do see. So is kind of a straw poll. Do we all agree on that?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so maybe for our attorney, if right now we have these, it looks like we're trying to move on the three options that the Public Works Director has given us, but how would we
I
work
see
in the
two
fact that I think many of the comments and many of the concerns have been about what happens to this, the simplest argument has been, if you do move there, you've basically left this to fall apart. There's no way you're going to be able to save it. So is there a way to put that into a motion that as a council, we seem to have consensus on wanting to preserve this building?
Well, the agenda item is set up for you to provide direction to staff. One piece of direction that's sought is the primary decision of whether or not to relocate city offices and council chambers to the commons or to retain them at City Hall. I think that as part of that direction, you could also ask staff to work on the preparation of some kind of policy statement from the council, potentially in the form of a resolution to be brought back. We would need to analyze any CEQA issues that might be implicated by that or anything else, but basically a policy statement by the council to preserve the historic elements of a city hall, including its role in the downtown historic district.
But don't we already have that? I mean, it's already on the register.
Right,
Yeah.
and but I think if you're looking to make an affirmatory statement that is the council's intent, that we can explore what the legal pathway would be to do that, but it is the case that it's already. If there is already a downtown historic district, the city hall is already an element of that. So that exists, but if you're looking for something to confirm that, we can work on crafting a document that would be not create additional legal issues, but that would express the council's intent that be the case, regardless of whether or not city offices and the council chambers remain.
So it's not something we can vote on tonight. So that have to be brought back to us at March 15th meeting.
I think we need to do it justice, but also, again, the item is really only set up to provide direction to staff.
Okay, and I'm asking the council that, let's say that one does not pass, that we don't, we vote to do 2 or 2A. It seems that all 5 of us are in agreement that we do want to maintain City Hall.
I think the word options confused the council. Apologize. So Julian's options are the options he's analyzing. They're not actually in the staff report.
They're here on this.
Right, but the staff report on page 3 specifically asks for direction and has the question. And it's not framed with options. So I think we confuse things because those are the options they analyze for cost purposes. We weren't bringing that question to you tonight, although it's relevant. It's relevant to the question we brought, which is the direction on what goes into the RFQ. That's the direction where we need decision by the end of March. Does anything beyond the library go into the RFQ? That's the question. that we need to resolve. The rest, once you resolve that, we can start bringing you other items to talk about all the issues that follow from what direction you give us on that question.
So if we agree to put it for the RFP to have both committee and it comes back an extraordinary number for us, then we'll have another decision to make whether we're gonna go forward with it.
No, you can't do that and pull out. What we put out in that RFQ's got to be what we're ready to build because of the timeline we're on with the
Okay,
state
with the
grant.
state grant, okay.
So that's why we're pressing you to make a decision on this direction. What Julian told you in his presentation is one of your options on the table is to say the RFQ is only about the library. And we want to still consider all of our options down the road. That just costs you more money because you won't capture the economies of scale that are available to you to make the decision now. But essentially, we would walk away with the decision about the RFQ. And if the decision is just do the library, as we said in the report, I think the first thing we'd want to do is commission a study for this building so we can go from a $12 and $18 million range to more real numbers. Because the ultimate challenge for staff with repurposing this, sorry, not repurposing, but building a new building inside this shell to serve as city hall for another 50 to 100 years, we need a design so we can actually price that number better than a $6 million range that we keep giving you. And so that would be my recommendation is if you say, I just want to go forward with the library, I don't feel comfortable, I'm not ready, whatever your decision is for that, that's fine. And then our recommendation back to you is we'd like to go find out how much it would cost us to get a design for this building. So we're talking about refined numbers and we're not still talking about these big ranges of numbers. That does carry a cost. That cost is high to just get the right types of planning and engineering done for the building. But until we do that, we'll always be stuck with a pretty big range in terms of the cost because we'll always have a lot of unknowns.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor.
Yes.
And this has been a good conversation and I appreciate everybody's comments. I apologize earlier for having misstated what I was proposing to move on. But I just wanted to, before I restate the motion that I would like to make. First of all, I think this issue of fiscal responsibility is a bit of a red herring for the reasons that I tried to bring out in my earlier questions about not including costs for what we would have to do to properly dispose of or recycle or whatever you want to call it of this building. So I think when you make an apples to apples comparison, the cost differences between these two options is probably not significant. More importantly, or at least as importantly, the fiscal discussion ignores an important part of what this discussion should be about. This is our city hall. It's always been our city hall. I think the community overall wants it to remain city hall, and that we are just going to have to make that happen. The aesthetic values, the historic values of preserving this building for its original intended purpose is something you can't put a price tag on, but it's very valuable. And I would be opposed, as I've said consistently in these discussions over time, to any approach that rejects that. So if I could restate the motion that I would like to make, reading from the staff report, because you're asking for direction, and I think that's clearly what the staff report says. I would move, when I am given the opportunity, to direct staff not to include city offices and additional multi-purpose spaces in the Commons project RFQ and plan for the rehabilitation of City Hall to continue serving as the city's primary office building. And that's right out of the staff report. So that would be my motion, Mr. Mayor, whenever you're ready for me to make it.
Okay. I did want to make a couple more comments. Just reflecting on everything that's been said tonight, on the cost piece, which has been a good discussion between Councilmember Candell and yourself. I do think that if we're committed to keeping this space, then it's not really going to be, well, we don't, with the knowns that we have, it's not really a big decider. If we need to put 6 or 8 and then 10 over there, it's still going to run up to 18. I'm pulled, because I feel that there's a split here, and I'm really trying to see if we have can build some consensus. I'm really pulled by the argument, it was made by someone here in the chambers that an effective library is really 1 person, 1 square foot per person in the town. And we know we're not going to achieve that. And if we do shared space, imagine, this larger room is built there and can be used for community meetings. We really have a better library. And then the access argument, we know that by 2030, a third of this county and Larkspur is going to be over 65. I think access is a huge question, and we can't gloss over that. And I'm a very, very nostalgic person, but I don't think we're saying that we take this building down if we vote against the first motion. I think that this does not have to be City Hall. I think it has to be, we've seen the consensus 5-0 that we want to keep this building, and we'll work on that. But what's the best for the community, for the library, for getting 1, square foot per person, and for having access and parking and so forth. So I'm leaning, I really would like us to reach a consensus, and maybe if there's last comments to be made, we can entertain your motion, Councilmember Haroff.
Thank you for that. I stated the motion. I don't know that I need to restate it.
I would like to make one comment before that.
Okay.
If I may. The fact that if we built at Rose Lane and commit to saving this building means we've doubled the square footage that we're going to have to maintain. Not just build, but also maintain down the future. And excuse me. May I finish?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Please continue.
So we're not talking about just the cost of building. We're talking the cost of maintaining possibly two separate structures. I don't think there's a need for that much meeting space. Once the library is gone from this building, and this is where I think I would like to see a much more in-depth facilities assessment, both for the cost, but also for the amount of usage that we're going to have. When we talk about using this as a multi-purpose room, say in the future too, and then we have also the library, I just see not only doubles the costs in the construction aspects of both, but also the long-term maintenance of it. And does a community of this size need that much space? And I don't think so. And that's my opinion.
Councilmember Way, I think you had something to say.
Sorry.
You're okay. Okay. And my only closing thought is, we don't have to decide tonight. We have till the 15th. And I'm wondering if 2 weeks, and I'm looking at our public works director and city manager, if there's any more information that, some of the questions that come up, could we have heritage funds? It sounds like we've reached the point where nothing can be answered, can be further answered in 2 weeks or in short term. I just wanted to confirm that's true.
I don't believe I can bring you any additional information other than I can bring you real ways to pay for the building. And I'm not trying to disparage some of the comments that were suggested this evening. I can only tell you that Mr. Skinner's done public buildings and I've done public buildings. I feel pretty confident in not only the numbers we're bringing you in terms of cost per square foot, and then they're not going to be brought down all that much, no matter how creative we get, because of the way public buildings have to be done. But also, I think I have an okay grip on where the money is out in the world that will pay for these things. And so at the end of the day, it's cash and debt service. That's how we're going to deal with whatever you decide.
And just to clarify, you said earlier, it seems like option one would be cash intensive and option two, if we preserve the building with 2 and 2A would allow for
No,
debt.
I didn't say that. Councilmember Candell said. I said you have $5 million in the general fund reserve that you parked waiting for this discussion. That essentially can go wherever you want to put it. Your policy is it'll go into infrastructure. So that's what it's parked for. And these are all questions of infrastructure. In previous meetings, I've pointed out to you, you probably have about 4 other pots of money that I think the reasons you've put the money in those locations apply to some of this discussion and might be something you want to use. Every pot of money that you use cash on is cash you don't have to apply somewhere else. So you have to have that discussion. And that's the next conversation wherever we go is use of money now and use of money in the future. And that's always what your challenge is with everything you pay for is a constant balance of cash and debt service.
One thing I would point out, the only change in 2 weeks would be that maybe the preservation board would have spoken up.
I guess I'd raise for the council that I think the council may want to frame what it is you want the preservation board to talk about because their code section doesn't really give them space for a conversation. So I don't know what they'll be talking about, what they'd be telling you. So
I only mentioned it. I agree with you completely that it should be directed, but I just thought it worth noting that they did schedule a meeting for next week and we've been told they'll be discussing this.
Can I just comment that I think our next meeting, we're doing rent stabilization, so I think it would,
special meeting.
I think it would make sense to decide on this tonight if possible.
Yeah, I think that's the consensus. Okay.
I think
yes.
I think there's a
Yes.
motion on the table.
Yes.
I can restate it if you need it.
Why don't you make your motion?
Again, I move that this council directs staff not to include city offices and additional multi-purpose spaces in the Commons Project RFQ and plan for the rehabilitation of City Hall to continue serving as the city's primary office building. And I think that will give you the direction that you've asked for. So that's my motion.
I will second.
Okay. So we have a motion and we have a second. Allison, roll call, please.
Councilmember Carroll,
Yes.
Councilmember Hara,
Yes.
Councilmember White,
No,
Councilmember Vice Mayor Kendall,
No.
Mayor Paulson.
Let's try to avoid this.
Okay, Solomon, split the baby.
Yes.
Motion passes 3-2 and the record needs to reflect no votes from Councilmember Way and Vice Mayor Candell. As additional comment from staff, we interpret this direction. We will complete preparations of the RFQ so that it can be issued. Staff doesn't need any further engagement with the council to issue the RFQ. But we will let you know when it's published. And then we're going to get some prices on what some various planning resources are to properly evaluate this building. That may be by issuing an RFP. That doesn't commit us to actually executing the contracts because they'll come back to you when we know what that would cost. In terms of that way, we can develop a plan for rehabilitation of this building so we can start to tighten those cost options. You'll still at some point, I think, want to have further conversation about what the use on Rose Lane ultimately may be. I think it may be time for the discussion to occur about what the campus on the commons actually looks like going forwards, because regardless of what it is we ultimately want to do there, we need to start thinking strategically about how we get to that point. And maybe what we're going to build with the RFQ is going to be sufficient and will be done. I don't know. So that conversation needs to take place. So those are probably future items.
Okay, can I ask staff, I have two questions. First of all, can I ask staff to prepare options of how we're going to come up with $18 million to renovate this building? I'd also like to ask staff to give us an analysis with the building, the single building that's being built at the library, how much of that is planning to be community space, community meeting rooms? So we have an idea of what we just voted on.
So I can answer the second question
Okay.
pretty easily. Effectively, the new facility will have one main multi-purpose room, which will be roughly the size of the room you're sitting in. Then there'll be a bunch of very tiny, what library folks call breakout rooms in the current library world. So those are really tiny rooms with like a 4-person table in them kind of thing. There'll be a few of those. And then there'll be a flexible multi-purpose space for the children's area.
And that's it.
Well,
okay.
You know, the Kathy Page methodology, the one,
It's ancient.
it's still actually generally the rule of thumb, but two confounding variables here are there's a slow shift in library spaces toward programming space and away from collection space. And so maybe there's some room to capture some more space that way. The other thing is we're really struggling with exactly what our service population is because it gets really confounded because we've kind of learned a portion of our community is more affiliated and has an affinity for the Corte Madera Library. But we also have learned Kentfield and Ross, some of those folks view our library as their library. So we're really actually been trying to figure out a good methodology to determine exactly what our service population truly is.
But would it be accurate that if you have a brand new building, probably more people are going to come to the library than the current building that we have now?
Well, I think programming drives that statement. And so I think what I have long been concerned about, and we may want to talk about down the road, building some sort of addition or secondary structure, or maybe there's a community attempt to raise money for that, is I think we are not going to be able to offer programming at the level that the community wants.
But if we do that after the end of the month, it's going to cost us an extra $1 million.
Possibly, yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we done?
Okay, so that concludes our meeting. Thank you, everybody, for attending and for your public comments, and we will have our next meeting March 15th. Good night.